Hello friends, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most disturbing chapters. Today, we're exploring a topic that will make you question the very limits of human religious devotion and the thin line between sanctity and self-destruction. If you'd like to share your thoughts in the comments about extreme religious practices, I'd love to hear from you. There's something both compelling and terrifying about exploring the darker corners of human faith from the safety of our modern, secular world. Picture this, you're a young woman in 14th century Italy. Society offers you exactly two paths: marriage to a man chosen by your family, or a life dedicated to God. But even choosing the religious path doesn't guarantee freedom. Unless you can prove your devotion so dramatically, so undeniably, that even the most powerful men in the church must acknowledge your direct connection to the divine. So you stop eating. First just bread and water. Then just water. Then nothing at all, except the communion wafer at Mass. Your body wastes away, your hair falls out, your teeth loosen in your gums, but everyone around you whispers that you're sustained by divine grace alone. You become a living saint until you become a dead one. This is the story we're about to explore: how medieval Christianity created a culture where starving yourself to death could be the path to sainthood, and how hundreds of holy women and some men literally fasted their way into both heaven and the grave. Chapter 1: The Theological Foundations of Holy Starvation. To understand how medieval society could celebrate and encourage people to starve themselves to death, we need to first grasp the theological framework that made such extreme behavior seem not just acceptable, but praiseworthy. Medieval Christianity was built on a fundamental distrust of the physical body. Influenced by ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Platonic thought, early Christian theologians developed a worldview that saw the body as a prison for the soul, a source of temptation and sin that prevented the spirit from achieving union with God. The flesh was weak, corrupt, and ultimately worthless compared to the eternal soul. This body-soul dualism reached its most extreme expression in the ascetic movement, which began in the 3rd and 4th centuries with the Desert Fathers, Christian hermits who retreated to the Egyptian desert to wage war against their own physical desires. These early ascetics practiced severe fasting, sleep deprivation, and self-mortification, believing that by punishing the body they could free the soul to commune directly with the divine. Saint Anthony of Egypt, one of the most famous Desert Fathers, reportedly ate only bread and water, and only after sunset, for years at a time. His biography, written by Saint Athanasius, became a bestseller throughout the medieval world and established the template for holy behavior. The more you could deny your body's needs, the closer you could come to God. But it was Saint Jerome, the great biblical scholar, who provided the theological justification that would echo through medieval Christianity for over 1,000 years. Jerome wrote, "It is shameful to say how much the unrestricted stomach hinders the mind's perspicacity and darkens the light of clear contemplation with dense fogs." In other words, eating too much, or really eating at all, clouded your ability to perceive divine truth. Jerome's influence cannot be overstated. His letters were copied and recopied throughout medieval monasteries, and his extreme views on fasting became orthodox doctrine. He praised young women who fasted so severely they damaged their health, calling them brides of Christ who had chosen spiritual marriage over earthly pleasure. He wrote approvingly of virgins who ate so little they resembled shadows rather than living beings. The theological foundation for holy starvation was further reinforced by medieval interpretations of Christ's own fasting. The Gospels record that Jesus fasted for 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his ministry, and medieval theologians argued that true Christians should strive to imitate Christ's suffering as completely as possible. If Jesus could fast for 40 days, how much more devoted would be the Christian who fasted for 40 weeks, or 40 months, or even until death itself? Medieval biblical commentary also emphasized the spiritual significance of hunger. The blessed were those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, and many medieval theologians interpreted this literally. Physical hunger was seen as a pathway to spiritual hunger, and spiritual hunger was the mark of the truly devout soul. The development of communion theology also played a crucial role in justifying extreme fasting. As the doctrine of transubstantiation became official church teaching in the 13th century, the communion wafer was understood to literally become the body of Christ. Medieval theologians argued that if you were truly receiving Christ's body in communion, you needed no other food. Some went even further, claiming that ordinary food would contaminate the sacred presence of Christ within the communicant's body. This theological framework created a perfect storm of religious justification for self-starvation. The body was evil and needed to be conquered. Hunger was spiritually beneficial. Christ himself had fasted. True devotion required extreme sacrifice, and communion provided all the nourishment a truly holy person needed. But theology alone cannot explain why this extreme form of religious devotion became so popular in medieval Europe. We must also understand the social and cultural factors that made fasting unto death seem like a reasonable, even admirable choice for devout Christians. Chapter 2: The Social Context of Sacred Starvation. Medieval society was obsessed with hierarchy, and the hierarchy of holiness was just as rigid as the hierarchy of social class. At the bottom were ordinary Christians who attended Mass and tried to avoid serious sin. Above them were the pious laity who engaged in extra prayers and charitable works. Higher still were monks and nuns who had renounced worldly pleasures. But at the very top were the saints, those rare individuals whose holiness was so extraordinary that they could perform miracles and intercede directly with God. For most people, sainthood was completely out of reach. You needed to be recognized by the church hierarchy, which meant having powerful patrons and political connections. You needed to perform verified miracles, which required witnesses and documentation. You needed a compelling life story that fit established patterns of sanctity. But extreme fasting offered a different path to recognition. Unlike other forms of religious devotion, severe fasting was immediately visible and impossible to fake. You couldn't pretend to be surviving on communion wafers alone. Your body would show the effects within weeks. If you could maintain extreme fasting for months or years while remaining active and appearing healthy, people would naturally conclude that you were receiving supernatural assistance. This visibility made fasting an attractive option for people who wanted religious authority but lacked other pathways to recognition. And in medieval Europe, this particularly applied to women, who were excluded from most forms of official religious leadership but could gain spiritual authority through extreme ascetic practices. Medieval women had virtually no control over their own lives. They could not choose their husbands, could not inherit property in their own names, could not pursue careers or education, and could not hold positions of authority in the church. But they could choose not to eat. And if they framed this choice in religious terms, society would often support and even celebrate their decision. Extreme fasting allowed medieval women to exercise a form of power that was otherwise denied to them. By controlling their food intake, they could control their bodies in ways that defied male authority. Parents could not force a daughter to eat if she claimed to be sustained by divine grace. Husbands could not compel wives to abandon fasting if it brought them religious recognition. Even church authorities hesitated to interfere with fasting that appeared to be divinely inspired. The social dynamics surrounding holy fasters were complex and often contradictory. On one hand, extreme fasters were revered as living saints whose prayers were especially powerful and whose advice carried divine authority. They attracted followers, received gifts, and influenced political and religious decisions. On the other hand, they were also viewed with suspicion and fear. Their extreme behavior challenged conventional religious practice and raised uncomfortable questions about the limits of orthodox devotion. Medieval chroniclers document numerous cases of communities becoming divided over holy fasters. Some residents would insist the faster was a genuine saint whose miracles proved divine favor. Others would claim the faster was either a fraud or a victim of demonic possession. These disputes could become quite heated, sometimes leading to violence between supporters and skeptics. The Church's response to extreme fasting was similarly ambivalent. Official doctrine supported moderate fasting as a legitimate spiritual discipline, and many canonized saints had practiced severe fasting at various points in their lives. But fasting that appeared to go beyond human endurance raised theological problems. If someone claimed to survive entirely on supernatural nourishment, were they truly human? If they rejected God's gift of food, were they showing devotion or ingratitude? If their extreme behavior influenced others to attempt similar fasting, were they leading souls to salvation or destruction? These concerns led church authorities to develop increasingly sophisticated methods for evaluating extreme fasters. They would station observers to watch for secret eating, test fasters' claims through various ordeals, and examine the theological implications of their teachings. but these investigations were often inconclusive, and the Church's official position on extreme fasting remained deliberately vague throughout the medieval period. The economic aspects of holy fasting also deserve attention. Extreme fasters typically attracted significant financial support from wealthy patrons who viewed their donations as investments in their own salvation. Families of holy fasters often became wealthy from the gifts and donations they received, creating economic incentives for encouraging and supporting extreme ascetic behavior. At the same time, extreme fasting imposed significant costs on families and communities. Someone who ate almost nothing still required care, shelter, and medical attention, particularly as their health deteriorated. The economic burden of supporting a holy faster could be substantial, especially for poor families who could least afford it. Medieval records show that some families went deeply into debt supporting a fasting relative, believing that the spiritual benefits outweighed the financial costs. Others abandoned or expelled family members whose extreme fasting became too burdensome to sustain. These economic pressures added another layer of complexity to the social dynamics surrounding holy starvation. The gender dynamics of extreme fasting were particularly significant in medieval society. While both men and women practiced severe fasting, the social meaning of their behavior was quite different. Male fasters were often viewed as following established monastic traditions and were more likely to receive official church recognition. Female fasters, however, were seen as more extraordinary precisely because extreme asceticism was considered unnatural for women. Medieval medical theory held that women were naturally weaker and more ruled by bodily appetites than men. A woman who could overcome these supposed natural limitations through extreme fasting was therefore demonstrating supernatural strength. This made female fasters simultaneously more remarkable and more suspect than their male counterparts. The social context of medieval fasting reveals a complex interplay of religious devotion, gender politics, economic incentives, and community dynamics. Understanding these factors is crucial for comprehending why extreme fasting became such a prominent feature of medieval religious life and why so many people were willing to literally starve themselves to death in pursuit of spiritual perfection. Chapter 3: The Physiology of Holy Starvation. What actually happens when you fast unto death? To truly understand the medieval practice of fasting unto death, we need to examine what actually happens to the human body during prolonged starvation. Medieval people had no scientific understanding of nutrition or metabolism, but modern medical knowledge can help us comprehend the horrific physical reality behind their spiritual ideals. The human body is remarkably resilient and has evolved sophisticated mechanisms for surviving periods of food scarcity. But these mechanisms have limits, and prolonged starvation triggers a cascade of physiological changes that ultimately lead to organ failure and death. During the first few days of complete fasting, the body depletes its stored glucose and begins breaking down glycogen in the liver and muscles. This process can sustain normal brain function for approximately 24 to 72 hours, depending on individual factors like body size and initial nutritional status. Many medieval fasters would have experienced this initial phase as relatively manageable, with symptoms limited to hunger pangs, mild weakness, and irritability. After the glycogen stores are exhausted, the body enters a state called ketosis, where it begins burning fat for energy and producing ketones that can partially fuel the brain. This metabolic shift often produces a temporary improvement in energy and mood, and many medieval fasters probably interpreted this phase as confirmation that God was providing supernatural sustenance. The euphoric feelings that often accompany early ketosis may explain why many holy fasters reported mystical visions and religious ecstasies during the initial stages of the fasting. The combination of ketones, dehydration, and sleep deprivation can produce profound alterations in consciousness that medieval people naturally interpreted as divine communications. But as starvation continues, the body's adaptive mechanisms begin to fail. After approximately 1 to 2 weeks of complete fasting, the body starts breaking down muscle tissue to provide amino acids for essential biological processes. This muscle wasting is initially invisible but gradually becomes apparent as weakness, fatigue, and loss of physical strength. Medieval chroniclers often noted that holy fasters became progressively weaker and more frail as their fasting continued, but they interpreted this physical deterioration as evidence that the spirit was being freed from the constraints of the flesh. What they were actually observing was a systematic breakdown of essential body systems. As starvation progresses, the body's metabolic rate slows dramatically in an attempt to conserve energy. core body temperature drops, heart rate decreases, and blood pressure falls. These changes explain why many medieval fasters were described as appearing unusually calm and peaceful. They were actually suffering from the neurological effects of severe malnutrition. The digestive system also undergoes significant changes during prolonged fasting. The stomach shrinks, digestive enzymes decrease, and the intestinal lining becomes thin and fragile. This explains why many holy fasters claimed they could no longer tolerate solid food even when they wanted to eat. Their digestive systems had literally atrophied to the point where normal eating became physically impossible. Medieval accounts often describe holy fasters as having unusually sweet breath or emanating pleasant odors despite their obvious physical deterioration. This phenomenon has a medical explanation. Severe ketosis produces acetone, which has a sweet, fruity smell. What medieval people interpreted as the odor of sanctity was actually a sign of dangerous metabolic dysfunction. Hair loss is another common effect of severe malnutrition that appears frequently in medieval accounts of holy fasters. As the body conserves energy for essential functions, it stops producing hair, nails, and other non-essential tissues. Many holy fasters were described as becoming bald or having extremely thin, brittle hair, which contemporary observers interpreted as a sign of spiritual transformation. The immune system also becomes severely compromised during extended starvation. White blood cell production decreases, and the body's ability to fight infections is dramatically reduced. Many medieval fasters died not from starvation itself, but from opportunistic infections that their weakened immune systems could not combat. Vitamin and mineral deficiencies create additional complications during prolonged fasting. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency causes bleeding gums, tooth loss, and skin problems. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency leads to bone deformities. Anemia from iron deficiency causes extreme fatigue and weakness. Medieval observers noted these symptoms but interpreted them as signs of spiritual purification rather than medical emergencies. The cardiovascular system is particularly vulnerable to the effects of starvation. As the body breaks down muscle tissue for energy, the heart muscle itself begins to deteriorate. Heart rate becomes irregular, blood pressure drops to dangerous levels, and the risk of sudden cardiac arrest increases dramatically. Many medieval fasters experienced what chroniclers described as holy seizures or divine raptures, episodes where they would lose consciousness and experience convulsions. These were likely episodes of hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar, or cardiac arrhythmias caused by electrolyte imbalances. Rather than recognizing these as medical emergencies, medieval observers interpreted them as signs that the faster was communicating directly with God. The brain is especially sensitive to starvation because it requires a constant supply of glucose to function properly. As blood sugar levels drop, cognitive function becomes impaired. Memory, judgment, and reasoning all deteriorate, which explains why many holy fasters made increasingly irrational decisions as their fasting progressed. Hallucinations are also common during severe starvation, as the brain struggles to function with inadequate fuel. Medieval fasters often reported elaborate visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints. While these experiences were interpreted as divine revelations, they were more likely symptoms of starvation-induced brain dysfunction. The psychological effects of starvation are as significant as the physical ones. Prolonged fasting often produces a condition that modern psychiatrists recognize as starvation euphoria, a paradoxical sense of well-being and spiritual elevation that occurs even as the body is shutting down. This psychological state helps explain why many holy fasters seemed genuinely content and peaceful even as they were dying. Starvation also affects personality and behavior in predictable ways. Starving individuals often become obsessed with food while simultaneously claiming to have no interest in eating. They may develop elaborate rituals around meal preparation for others while refusing to eat themselves. They often become increasingly rigid and controlling, particularly around issues related to food and eating. These behavioral changes are clearly documented in medieval accounts of holy fasters, who were often described as spending hours cooking elaborate meals for others while consuming nothing themselves. What medieval people interpreted as selfless devotion was actually a symptom of starvation-induced psychological disturbance. The final stages of death by starvation are particularly horrific. As organ systems begin to fail, the body experiences multiple complications simultaneously. The liver cannot process toxins effectively, leading to a buildup of poisonous substances in the blood. The kidneys fail, causing dangerous fluid retention and electrolyte imbalances. The heart struggles to pump blood effectively, leading to poor circulation and tissue death. Medieval chroniclers often noted that holy fasters appeared to be glowing or radiant in their final days. This effect was likely caused by jaundice, a yellowing of the skin caused by liver failure that can appear golden in 7 lighting conditions. Once again, what medieval people interpreted as a sign of divine favor was actually a symptom of organ failure. The actual moment of death in starvation cases is usually caused by cardiac arrest triggered by electrolyte imbalances or heart muscle deterioration. The process can be relatively peaceful, as the person is typically unconscious or semi-conscious due to brain dysfunction caused by prolonged malnutrition. Understanding the physiological reality of death by starvation makes the medieval practice of holy fasting even more disturbing. These were not peaceful, spiritual transitions to a higher plane of existence. They were prolonged, agonizing medical emergencies that medieval society celebrated as the ultimate expression of religious devotion. The contrast between the spiritual interpretation and the medical reality reveals just how profoundly medieval people misunderstood the basic functioning of the human body. Their theological framework prevented them from recognizing that they were witnessing and encouraging a particularly slow and painful form of suicide. Chapter 4: Notable cases, the saints who starved themselves to death. Now let's examine some of the most famous and well-documented cases of medieval holy fasters who literally starved themselves to death in pursuit of spiritual perfection. These stories reveal the individual human tragedies behind the broader theological and social phenomena we've been discussing. Saint Catherine of Siena 1347–1380. Catherine Benincasa was born in Siena, Italy, the 23rd of 25 children in a middle-class family. Her extreme fasting began in adolescence as a way to resist her parents' attempts to arrange a marriage. By refusing to eat, she could make herself so physically unattractive and unhealthy that no man would want to marry her. What began as a practical strategy for avoiding marriage evolved into something far more extreme. Catherine gradually reduced her food intake until she claimed to survive entirely on communion wafers and holy water. Contemporary accounts describe her as consuming no other food or drink for the final years of her life. Catherine's confessor, Raymond of Capua, documented her eating habits in detail. He wrote that she could not consume ordinary food without becoming violently ill, and that any attempt to eat solid food would cause immediate vomiting. Modern medical knowledge suggests that Catherine had damaged her digestive system through prolonged starvation to the point where normal eating was indeed physically impossible. Raymond also noted that Catherine would sometimes force herself to vomit by pushing twigs or small branches down her throat, a behavior that clearly parallels modern bulimia nervosa. But in the medieval context, this self-induced vomiting was interpreted as proof that her body had been so purified by divine grace that it could no longer tolerate corrupted earthly food. Catherine's extreme fasting gave her enormous spiritual authority. She corresponded with popes and emperors, influenced church policy, and attracted followers from across Europe. Her letters reveal a brilliant theological mind, but they also show the psychological effects of chronic starvation, obsessive focus on food and eating, rigid thinking patterns, and increasingly grandiose claims about her own spiritual significance. The physical effects of Catherine's prolonged starvation were severe and well documented. Contemporary accounts describe her as extremely thin, with sunken eyes, protruding bones, and skin that appeared almost transparent. She suffered from frequent fainting spells, seizures, and periods of unconsciousness that were interpreted as mystical raptures. In her final months, Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. She experienced what modern doctors would recognize as the classic symptoms of end-stage starvation: severe weakness, inability to stand or walk, episodes of delirium, and progressive organ failure. She died at age 33, and her body was so wasted that contemporary observers noted she appeared to weigh almost nothing. Catherine was canonized in 1461, and her extreme fasting was cited as evidence of her extraordinary holiness. The Church's official biography presents her starvation as a miraculous sign of divine favor rather than the tragic result of a eating disorder that developed in response to social pressures. Blessed Angela of Foligno 1248–1309. Angela was born into a wealthy family in central Italy and lived a conventional life as a wife and mother until experiencing a religious conversion in her late 30s. After the death of her husband and children, which she interpreted as divine liberation from worldly attachments, Angela began practicing increasingly severe ascetic disciplines. Her fasting began gradually, but became progressively more extreme. Angela claimed that ordinary food had become repulsive to her and that she could survive on communion alone. Unlike Catherine of Siena, who maintained some social engagement, Angela became increasingly isolated as her fasting intensified. Contemporary accounts describe Angela as becoming skeletal in appearance, with sunken cheeks, protruding ribs, and arms so thin that observers could encircle her wrists with their thumb and forefinger. She suffered from chronic weakness, frequent illnesses, and progressive loss of physical capabilities. Angela's mystical experiences became more frequent and intense as her physical condition deteriorated. She reported elaborate visions, conversations with Christ, and periods of divine ecstasy that lasted for hours. Modern medical understanding suggests these experiences were likely hallucinations caused by severe malnutrition and dehydration. What makes Angela's case particularly tragic is that she explicitly connected her fasting to self-punishment. Her writings revealed deep feelings of guilt and unworthiness, and she seems to have used starvation as a form of penance for what she perceived as a sinful early life. Her death by starvation was essentially a prolonged suicide motivated by religious guilt. Saint Lidwina of Skedum 1380-1433. Lidwina's case is somewhat different because her extreme fasting reportedly began after a skating accident that left her seriously injured. However, medical historians now suspect that her supposed miraculous survival without food was actually an elaborate fraud perpetrated by her family and supporters. According to her hagiography, Lidwina ate nothing for the final 28 years of her life except occasional communion wafers. She was said to remain alert and active despite consuming no food, and numerous miracles were attributed to her intercession. However, skeptical investigation by church authorities revealed significant inconsistencies in the accounts of Lidwina's fasting. Witnesses gave contradictory testimony about her eating habits, and there was evidence that food was being secretly delivered to her room. Modern historians believe that Lidwina probably practiced severe but not complete fasting, with her supporters exaggerating her abstinence for religious and financial reasons. Lidwina's case illustrates how the cult of holy fasting created incentives for fraud and exaggeration. Families could gain significant social status and economic benefits by promoting a relative as a miraculous faster, leading to systematic deception about the reality of these supposed divine interventions. Saint Columba of Redi 1467-1501. Columba represents one of the most extreme examples of medieval religious self-harm. Born into a noble family, she began fasting as a young child and continued until her death at age 34. But her ascetic practices extended far beyond simple food restriction. Contemporary accounts describe Columba as engaging in elaborate self-torture rituals, including beating herself with chains, sleeping on beds of thorns, and deliberately exposing herself to extreme cold. She also practiced severe fasting, claiming to consume nothing but communion wafers for years at a time. Columba's extreme behavior was motivated partly by her determination to avoid sexual assault. She deliberately mutilated her own body to make herself sexually unattractive, reportedly disfiguring her breasts and hips with spiked chains. This self-mutilation was praised by contemporary observers as evidence of her commitment to virginity. The combination of self-starvation and physical abuse eventually killed Columba, but not before she had attracted a significant following and influenced religious policy in her region. Her death was seen as martyrdom, and she was quickly recognized as a blessed by local church authorities. The case of Blessed Pierre de Luxembourg 1369-1387. Pierre's case demonstrates that extreme fasting was not limited to women, though male fasters were less common and often faced different social expectations. Born into one of Europe's most powerful noble families, Pierre rejected worldly success in favor of religious devotion. Despite having access to the finest food and medical care available in the 14th century, Pierre chose to practice severe fasting and other ascetic disciplines. He reportedly ate only bread and water for extended periods and claimed to receive divine nourishment that made ordinary food unnecessary. Pierre's extreme asceticism was complicated by his high political position. He was made a cardinal at age 18 and was expected to participate in church politics and social functions. His refusal to eat at official dinners and his gaunt appearance created diplomatic problems and embarrassed his family and colleagues. Pierre died at age 18 from what contemporary accounts describe as a combination of starvation and fever. Modern medical analysis suggests he died from complications related to severe malnutrition, possibly including immune system failure that left him vulnerable to opportunistic infections. His early death was immediately interpreted as martyrdom, and he was beatified by the Church despite questions about whether his extreme fasting represented virtue or mental illness. His case illustrates how social and political factors influenced the Church's evaluation of extreme ascetic behavior. The broader pattern. These individual cases reveal several consistent patterns in medieval holy fasting. First, extreme fasting often began as a practical strategy for dealing with social pressures, particularly pressure to marry or conform to gender expectations. Second, what began as strategic behavior often evolved into compulsive patterns that the individuals could no longer control. Third, the physical and psychological effects of starvation created experiences that both the fasters and their observers interpreted as supernatural interventions. The medical reality behind these cases is that they represent prolonged suicides by starvation, motivated by complex combinations of religious devotion, social pressure, and psychological disturbance. The fact that medieval societies celebrated these deaths as spiritual victories reveals just how profoundly the theological framework distorted their understanding of basic human needs and dignity. These stories also demonstrate the gendered nature of extreme fasting in medieval culture. Female fasters were often trying to escape traditional women's roles and gain spiritual authority otherwise denied to them. Male fasters, by contrast, were usually rejecting worldly success and political power that was already available to them. In both cases, extreme fasting served as a form of social rebellion, albeit one that ultimately destroyed the rebels themselves. The tragic irony of these cases is that many of these individuals were genuinely seeking spiritual transcendence and connection with the divine. Their intense religious experiences, brought on by starvation-induced hallucinations and euphoria, convinced them they were on the right path even as their bodies were shutting down. Medieval theology provided a framework that made their sufferings seem meaningful and their deaths appear victorious. Understanding these individual stories helped us comprehend both the human cost of medieval religious extremism and the complex social and psychological factors that motivated people to choose death by starvation over life in the medieval world. Each case represents not just a theological curiosity but a personal tragedy of someone who found their society so constraining or their inner pain so unbearable that slow death seemed preferable to continued existence. Chapter 5: The Psychology of Sacred Starvation, Understanding the Medieval Mind. Now that we've examined the individual cases and physiological realities of holy fasting, we need to delve deeper into the psychological landscape that made such extreme behavior not just possible, but celebrated. To truly comprehend why medieval people chose to starve themselves to death in the name of God, we must understand the complex interplay of mental, social, and spiritual factors that created the perfect storm for this deadly practice. The psychological dimensions of medieval holy fasting reveal a fascinating and disturbing intersection of faith, mental health, social pressure, and individual psychology that challenges our modern understanding of both religious devotion and mental illness. These were not simple cases of religious extremism, but complex psychological phenomena that emerged from the unique conditions of medieval society. Modern psychiatric analysis of historical accounts reveals striking parallels between medieval holy fasting and contemporary eating disorders, particularly anorexia nervosa. However, we must be careful not to impose modern diagnostic categories on medieval behavior without understanding the cultural context that gave these actions meaning. What we see as symptoms of mental illness, medieval people understood as signs of spiritual grace. The psychological profile of medieval holy fasters reveals several consistent patterns that help us understand both their motivations and their ultimate fate. First and most importantly, extreme fasting provided a sense of control in lives that were otherwise completely controlled by external forces. For medieval women especially, who had virtually no autonomy over their marriages, careers, living situations, or even basic daily decisions, controlling food intake became a way to exercise power over at least one aspect of their existence. This need for control manifested itself in increasingly elaborate and rigid food rituals. Medieval accounts describe holy fasters who would spend hours arranging and rearranging tiny portions of food they never intended to eat, who developed complex systems for categorizing pure and impure foods, and who became obsessed with the spiritual significance of every morsel they consumed or rejected. The psychological function of these rituals extended far beyond simple food restriction. They created a structured framework for daily life that gave meaning and purpose to otherwise powerless individuals. When Catherine of Siena spent hours preparing elaborate meals for others while consuming nothing herself, she wasn't just demonstrating spiritual devotion, she was creating a sense of agency and importance in a world that offered her few other opportunities for significance. The element of martyrdom also played a crucial psychological role in motivating extreme fasting. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on the spiritual value of suffering, teaching that voluntary pain could expiate sin and bring the sufferer closer to Christ. For individuals seeking meaning in difficult lives, the promise that their suffering served a higher purpose provided powerful psychological motivation to continue even when their bodies were failing. This martyrdom complex was particularly appealing to people who felt powerless in other areas of their lives. By choosing to suffer, they transformed themselves from victims of circumstance into active participants in their own spiritual drama. The pain became meaningful rather than meaningless, and death became victory rather than defeat. The psychological literature on modern eating disorders identifies several key factors that increase vulnerability to these conditions: perfectionism, need for control, low self-esteem, trauma history, and social pressure to conform to unrealistic standards. When we examine medieval holy fasting through this lens, we find all of these factors present in abundance. Medieval society created perfect conditions for developing eating disorders. The emphasis on spiritual perfection created unrealistic standards that could never be fully achieved. The social hierarchy provided constant reminders of personal inadequacy and powerlessness. Trauma was commonplace, whether from violence, disease, or family disruption. And the religious culture specifically valorized food restriction as a sign of spiritual advancement. But medieval holy fasting differed from modern eating disorders in crucial ways that help explain why it was celebrated rather than treated as illness. Most importantly, the cultural framework provided positive meaning for the behavior. While modern anorexics often struggle with shame and secrecy, medieval holy fasters were celebrated as living saints whose behavior was seen as divinely inspired. This social validation created a feedback loop that reinforced the fasting behavior. The more extreme the fasting became, the more attention and admiration the faster received from their community. This positive reinforcement made it psychologically easier to continue the behavior even as it became physically dangerous. The role of religious visions and mystical experiences in sustaining holy fasting cannot be understated. As we discussed in our examination of the physiology of starvation, prolonged fasting creates profound alterations in brain chemistry that can produce hallucinations, euphoria, and altered states of consciousness. However, medieval people had no scientific framework for understanding these experiences and naturally interpreted them as divine communications. These starvation-induced visions became central to the psychological experience of holy fasting. They provided confirmation that the suffering was worthwhile and that divine approval was being received. The visions also created a sense of special relationship with God that elevated the faster above ordinary believers and justified continued extreme behavior. The content of these visions typically reinforced the fasting behavior. Christ would appear to encourage continued suffering, the Virgin Mary would promise rewards for perseverance, or various saints would provide spiritual instruction that emphasized the importance of bodily mortification. These experiences, however they were actually produced, created powerful psychological motivation to continue fasting even unto death. The social psychology of medieval communities also played a crucial role in sustaining holy fasting behavior. These practices didn't occur in isolation but within complex webs of family, community, and religious relationships that both enabled and constrained the fasting behavior. Chapter 6: The Social Dynamics of Sacred Starvation. Understanding medieval holy fasting requires examining not just individual psychology but the broader social dynamics that made such extreme behavior possible and sustainable. These practices emerged from and were shaped by complex interactions between families, communities, religious authorities, and political structures that created environments where starving oneself to death could seem like a reasonable and even admirable choice. The family dynamics surrounding holy fasters were particularly complex and often contradictory. On one hand, families frequently took pride in having a holy member whose spiritual achievements reflected well on the entire household. Having a living saint in the family brought prestige, attracted financial donations, and provided spiritual insurance for other family members who believed the holy person's prayers and intercession would benefit them in this life and the next. But families also bore the practical burden of caring for someone who was slowly dying of self-imposed starvation. Holy fasters required constant attention and care as their physical condition deteriorated. They needed help with basic tasks as weakness and illness made normal activities impossible. They often developed expensive medical needs that families could ill afford. The economic implications were significant. While holy fasters might attract donations from admirers, they also consumed family resources while contributing little productive labor. Families had to weigh the spiritual and social benefits against the practical cost of supporting a gradually dying relative. These competing pressures created complex family dynamics that sometimes bordered on the exploitative. Some families actively encouraged and promoted their relatives' fasting because of the financial and social benefits it brought. Others tried desperately to convince the family member to eat normally, only to be told that God had forbidden all food except communion wafers. The case of Catherine of Siena illustrates these family tensions clearly. Her parents initially opposed her religious extremism and tried to force her into marriage and normal domestic roles. But as Catherine's reputation for holiness grew and began attracting followers and donations, the family's attitude shifted. They began to see her fasting as a valuable family asset rather than a dangerous liability. This shift in family attitudes created additional psychological pressure on holy fasters to maintain their extreme behavior. Once families became financially and socially dependent on their relatives' reputation for holiness, any attempt to return to normal eating would not only feel like spiritual failure, but would also mean betraying family expectations and economic needs. The broader community dynamics were equally complex. Holy fasters became focal points for a local religious activity, attracting pilgrims, generating donations for local churches, and providing communities with a sense of special divine favor. Towns and villages competed for recognition as places where miraculous holy people lived, and having a famous faster could bring significant economic and political benefits. But communities also had to manage the social disruption that extreme religious behavior could create. Holy fasters attracted crowds of visitors who needed food, lodging, and other services. They sometimes made prophetic pronouncements that challenged local political or religious authorities. They required protection from skeptics who might try to expose them as frauds. The community response to holy fasting was therefore ambivalent, part celebration, part exploitation, and part social management. Communities wanted to benefit from having a holy person in their midst while minimizing the practical problems such individuals could create. The gender dynamics of medieval holy fasting were particularly pronounced and reveal much about the limited options available to women in medieval society. The overwhelming majority of documented extreme fasters were female, and this disparity reflects the restricted pathways to religious authority and social recognition available to medieval women. Men had multiple routes to religious recognition and authority. They could become priests, monks, theologians, or missionaries. They could demonstrate holiness through learning, preaching, charitable work, or military service in religious causes. Women, however, were excluded from most formal religious roles and had few accepted ways to demonstrate extraordinary spiritual devotion. Extreme fasting provided one of the few pathways through which medieval women could achieve religious authority and social recognition. By demonstrating supernatural control over their bodies, women could claim direct divine communication that superseded normal gender hierarchies. A woman who survived on communion alone could speak with authority about spiritual matters in ways that would otherwise be forbidden to her gender. This helps explain why women were willing to pursue fasting to such dangerous extremes. The potential route was spiritual authority, social recognition. Escape from traditional gender roles was so significant that they justified enormous risks. For women facing forced marriages, unwanted pregnancies, or lives of domestic servitude, holy fasting offered an alternative path that could lead to veneration rather than subordination. The Church's response to female fasting was consequently complex and often contradictory. On one hand, church authorities recognized that some holy fasters had achieved genuine spiritual insights and attracted significant popular devotion that could benefit the institution. On the other hand, they were suspicious of claims to direct divine communication that bypassed normal ecclesiastical authority, especially when these claims came from women. This tension led to the development of increasingly sophisticated procedures for evaluating holy fasters. Church authorities would assign priests to observe fasters closely, looking for evidence of secret eating or other deception. They would test fasters' theological knowledge to determine if their spiritual insights were genuinely divine or merely the product of learning or mental illness. These investigations themselves became part of the social dynamics surrounding holy fasting. The knowledge that they were being watched and tested added additional psychological pressure to fasters, who knew that any sign of fraud or theological error could result in condemnation rather than canonization. Some fasters undoubtedly pushed themselves to greater extremes in order to provide more convincing evidence of divine favor. The political dimensions of holy fasting also deserve attention. In an age when political and religious authority were closely intertwined, holy people could wield significant influence over political decisions. Rulers sought their blessing for military campaigns, their advice on policy matters, and their intercession for political problems. This political influence created additional incentives for extreme religious behavior. A successful holy faster could potentially influence kings and emperors, shape military campaigns, and affect the fate of entire kingdoms. For individuals from humble backgrounds, this represented an extraordinary opportunity for social advancement and historical significance. But political involvement also created dangers. Holy fasters who took controversial political positions or challenged established authorities risked persecution and condemnation. They had to navigate complex political relationships while maintaining their reputation for spiritual purity and divine communication. The economic aspects of holy fasting created their own social dynamics. Successful holy fasters could generate significant wealth through donations, pilgrimage tourism, and the sale of blessed objects or relics. This economic potential attracted both genuine devotees and calculating opportunists who saw holy fasting as a path to financial success. The commercialization of holiness created pressure for increasingly spectacular displays of divine favor. Holy fasters competed not just for spiritual recognition, but for economic patronage from wealthy donors. This competition could drive behavior to ever greater extremes as fasters tried to distinguish themselves from rivals and maintain their audience's attention and financial support. Communities also developed economic dependencies on their local holy people. Pilgrim tourism could become a significant source of local income, creating pressure to maintain and promote the holy person's reputation regardless of their actual physical or spiritual condition. Chapter 7: The Church's Dilemma, Sanctity or Pathology. The medieval Catholic Church found itself in an extraordinarily difficult position when confronting the phenomenon of extreme religious fasting. On one hand, the Church's own theological traditions clearly supported the spiritual value of fasting and bodily mortification. On the other hand, the extreme forms of fasting that were killing devout Christians raised serious questions about the difference between holy devotion and dangerous delusion. This fundamental tension created a complex and often contradictory institutional response that evolved over several centuries as the Church struggled to develop coherent policies for evaluating and managing extreme religious behavior. The challenge was made even more difficult by the popularity of holy fasters among ordinary believers, who often venerated extreme fasters regardless of official church positions. The theological framework that guided church thinking about fasting was deeply rooted in scripture and early Christian tradition. Christ himself had fasted for 40 days, and the early desert fathers had practiced severe asceticism that often included extreme food restriction. The Church's liturgical calendar included multiple fasting periods, and monastic rules prescribed regular fasting as part of religious discipline. But Church theologians also recognized that excessive fasting could become spiritually harmful. The cardinal sin of pride could manifest through extreme ascetic practices pursued for personal glory rather than genuine devotion. Despair could drive people to self-destructive behavior disguised as religious devotion. And mental illness could produce religious delusions that mimic genuine spiritual experiences. The challenge for church authorities was developing criteria that could reliably distinguish between holy fasting and pathological behavior. This was particularly difficult because many of the observable characteristics were similar. Both holy and pathological fasters might claim divine visions, refuse all food, and eventually die from starvation. The Church's initial response was to focus on the spiritual fruits of fasting behavior. If a faster attracted genuine devotion from others, produced theological insights, performed apparent miracles, and inspired others to greater piety, these were seen as signs that their behavior was divinely inspired rather than pathologically motivated. But this approach proved problematic because it essentially validated extreme fasting based on its social success rather than its intrinsic spiritual value. This created incentives for fasters to pursue ever more dramatic displays of religious devotion in order to attract the attention and admiration that would confirm their holy status. As extreme fasting cases multiplied and became more widely known, church authorities developed more sophisticated evaluation procedures. These typically involved appointing a commission of theologians and physicians to investigate specific cases, examine witnesses, and attempt to determine whether claimed miraculous survival was genuine or fraudulent. These investigations revealed the complexity of medieval holy fasting phenomena. In many cases, investigators found evidence of secret eating or other deception, suggesting that some holy fasters were conscious frauds taking advantage of popular credulity. In other cases, they found evidence of genuine food restriction but concluded that survival was being sustained through medical rather than miraculous means. But investigators also encountered cases that seemed to defy conventional explanation. Some fasters appeared to survive for extended periods with minimal or no food intake while maintaining relatively normal activity levels. Others demonstrated knowledge or abilities that seemed to exceed their educational background or life experience. The Church's response to these seemingly inexplicable cases was cautious and often ambivalent. Rather than definitively declaring such cases miraculous or fraudulent, Church authorities often took middle positions that acknowledged the unusual nature of the phenomena while avoiding firm commitments about their supernatural status. This cautious approach reflected both theological uncertainty and practical politics. Definitively endorsing extreme fasting could encourage dangerous imitation and potentially validate pathological behavior. But condemning popular holy figures could alienate believers and damage the Church's spiritual authority. The development of formal canonization procedures in the later medieval period created additional pressure for more rigorous evaluation of holy fasting cases. The process of declaring someone a saint required detailed investigation of their life and alleged miracles, including any claims about miraculous survival without food. These canonization investigations produced extensive documentation that provides modern historians with detailed information about medieval holy fasting. But they also reveal the difficulty Church authorities faced in applying consistent criteria to evaluate extreme religious behavior. The case of Catherine of Siena illustrates these institutional challenges clearly. Catherine's extreme fasting was well documented and witnessed by numerous reliable observers. Her theological writings demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Christian doctrine. She played significant political roles in church affairs and was widely venerated during her lifetime. But Catherine also died at a young age from what appears to have been complications related to malnutrition. Her behavior patterns resembled what modern medicine would classify as eating disorder symptoms, and her extreme claims about surviving entirely on communion wafers raised questions about either deception or delusion. The Church's ultimate decision to canonize Catherine in 1461 represented a complex institutional judgment that weighed her spiritual contributions against concerns about her extreme behavior. The canonization effectively endorsed the view that her fasting was divinely inspired rather than pathological, but this decision remained controversial even within church circles. The institutional challenges were compounded by regional variations in how different parts of the Church responded to holy fasting. Italian authorities often showed more tolerance for extreme mystical behavior than their Northern European counterparts. Franciscan and Dominican religious orders, which emphasized poverty and asceticism, were generally more supportive of extreme fasting than Benedictine monasteries that stressed moderation. These institutional variations created inconsistent messages about the acceptability of extreme fasting. A behavior pattern that might be condemned as dangerous in one region could be celebrated as miraculous in another. This inconsistency made it difficult for church authorities to develop coherent policies and gave potential holy fasters mixed signals about whether their behavior would be supported or suppressed. The Church also struggled with the gender dynamics of extreme fasting. The disproportionate number of female extreme fasters raised questions about whether women were more susceptible to religious delusion or more capable of achieving mystical union with God. Different theological traditions offer different answers to these questions, creating additional uncertainty about how to evaluate female religious behavior. Some church authorities viewed female mystical experiences with deep suspicion, seeing them as evidence of women's inherent spiritual weakness and susceptibility to demonic influence. Others argued that women's supposed spiritual sensitivity made them more capable than men of achieving direct communication with God. These competing perspectives created inconsistent institutional responses to female fasting that often depended more on local attitudes and political considerations than on coherent theological principles. Women who achieved political or social prominence through their fasting were more likely to receive official church support than those whose extreme behavior remained purely private. The economic implications of holy fasting also influenced church responses. Popular holy fasters could generate significant revenue for local churches through pilgrimage tourism and donations. This economic potential created incentives for church authorities to support or at least tolerate extreme fasting behavior even when they had theological reservations about its spiritual value. But the commercialization of holiness also created scandal risks that concerned church authorities. If a celebrated holy faster was later exposed as fraudulent, this could damage not only local church revenues but the broader institution's credibility and spiritual authority. The Church's ultimate response to extreme fasting was therefore pragmatic rather than purely theological. Rather than developing clear doctrinal positions that would definitively validate or condemn the practice, church authorities adopted flexible approaches that allowed them to support successful cases while distancing themselves from failures. This pragmatic approach meant that the Church never definitively resolved the fundamental questions raised by extreme religious fasting. The tension between celebrating ascetic devotion and preventing dangerous self-harm remained unresolved throughout the medieval period and continues to challenge religious authorities today. Chapter 8: The Neurochemistry of Divine Visions. One of the most compelling aspects of medieval holy fasting accounts is the frequent reporting of vivid mystical experiences, divine visions, and supernatural communications. Modern neuroscience provides us with fascinating insights into how prolonged starvation affects brain chemistry and consciousness in ways that can produce experiences that medieval people naturally interpreted as divine interventions. Understanding the neurological basis of starvation-induced altered consciousness doesn't diminish the spiritual significance these experiences held for medieval practitioners. Instead, it helps us comprehend how the physiological realities of extreme fasting created the mental states that reinforced and sustained these dangerous behaviors. The human brain is exquisitely sensitive to changes in nutrition and metabolism. Under normal conditions, the brain consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy, requiring a constant supply of glucose to maintain proper function. When this supply is disrupted through fasting or starvation, the brain undergoes a series of adaptive changes that can profoundly alter consciousness and perception. During the initial stages of fasting, as blood glucose levels drop, the brain begins to utilize ketones produced from fat metabolism as an alternative fuel source. This metabolic shift, known as ketosis, often produces what many fasters describe as mental clarity, elevated mood, and increased energy. Medieval holy fasters frequently reported feeling more spiritually attuned and mentally sharp during the early phases of their fasting, which they interpreted as signs of divine approval and supernatural enhancement of their spiritual faculties. But the euphoric effects of early ketosis are temporary. As fasting continues and the body's fat reserves are depleted, the brain begins to experience more serious nutritional stress. Neurotransmitter production becomes disrupted, particularly affecting serotonin, dopamine, and GABA systems that regulate mood, perception, and consciousness. These neurochemical changes create conditions that are highly conducive to hallucinations and altered states of consciousness. Low serotonin levels, similar to those seen in depression, can produce visual and auditory hallucinations. Disrupted dopamine function can create feelings of profound spiritual significance and meaning even in mundane experiences. Altered GABA levels can produce dissociative states where individuals feel separated from their physical bodies. The specific content of starvation-induced hallucinations is heavily influenced by the individual's cultural background and expectations. Medieval Christians experiencing these neurochemical changes would naturally interpret their altered perceptions through the lens of their religious beliefs, seeing visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints rather than the abstract patterns or meaningless imagery that might be experienced by secular individuals. The timing of these experiences also follows predictable neurological patterns. Medieval accounts consistently report that the most vivid and meaningful mystical experiences occur after several weeks or months of severe food restriction, which corresponds to the point when starvation begins to seriously affect brain chemistry. Earlier in the fasting process, practitioners might report increased spiritual sensitivity or clarity, but the dramatic visions and divine communications typically emerged only after prolonged nutritional deprivation. The content of these visions also reveals their neurological origins. Medieval holy fasters consistently reported seeing religious figures who encouraged them to continue their fasting, provided spiritual instruction that reinforced ascetic practices, and promised rewards for perseverance in their suffering. This pattern suggests that the brain, under extreme stress, was producing experiences that psychologically motivated continued self-harmful behavior. This creates a tragic feedback loop where starvation-induced hallucinations convince the faster that their dangerous behavior is divinely mandated and spiritually beneficial. The more severe the nutritional deprivation becomes, the more vivid and compelling the visions become, providing increasingly powerful psychological motivation to continue fasting even as the physical consequences become life-threatening. Modern research on sensory deprivation and extreme fasting has documented similar phenomena in controlled settings. Participants in prolonged fasting studies frequently report mystical experiences, feelings of transcendence, and vivid visual phenomena that they interpret as profoundly meaningful even when they understand the neurological basis of their experiences. Sleep deprivation, which was often an additional component of medieval religious practices, compounds these neurological effects. Holy fasters frequently combined food restriction with prolonged prayer vigils and minimal sleep, creating conditions that further destabilized normal brain chemistry and increased susceptibility to hallucinations and altered consciousness. The social context of medieval holy fasting also reinforced the neurological effects. When fasters reported their visions to others, they received validation and encouragement that confirmed the reality and spiritual significance of their experiences. This social reinforcement created additional psychological pressure to continue the behavior that was producing the visions, even as it was simultaneously destroying the body. Medieval accounts also reveal that the quality and content of visions often deteriorated as fasting continued to more extreme stages. While early visions were typically described as beautiful, peaceful, and inspiring, later experiences often became more disturbing, featuring demons, threats, or commands for even more extreme forms of self-punishment. This progression corresponds to the increasing severity of brain dysfunction as starvation approaches fatal levels. The physiological stress of extreme fasting also triggers the release of endogenous opioids, natural pain-relieving compounds produced by the body in response to severe physical distress. These substances can produce feelings of euphoria and transcendence that medieval fasters interpreted as spiritual ecstasy. The addictive potential of these natural opioids may help explain why some individuals found it psychologically impossible to abandon their fasting practices even when they recognized the physical dangers. Dehydration, which was often an additional component of extreme fasting, creates its own neurological effects that further alter consciousness. Severe dehydration can produce confusion, hallucinations, and dissociative experiences that compound the effects of malnutrition on brain function. The medieval understanding of these experiences as divine communications created a theological framework that made sense of otherwise incomprehensible alterations in consciousness. Without modern knowledge of neuroscience and brain chemistry, medieval people had no other explanatory framework for understanding why prolonged fasting produced such profound changes in perception and consciousness. This neurological perspective helps explain why extreme fasting became self-reinforcing rather than self-limiting. Unlike other forms of self-harm that typically produce only negative experiences that discourage repetition, extreme fasting generated powerful positive psychological experiences that motivated continuation of the harmful behavior. Understanding the neurochemistry of starvation-induced altered consciousness also helps explain why medieval authorities found it so difficult to distinguish between genuine spiritual experiences and pathological delusions. The subjective experiences were indeed profound and meaningful to those who underwent them, even though they were produced by brain dysfunction rather than divine intervention. Chapter 9: The Ripple Effects: How Holy Fasting Shaped Medieval Society. The phenomenon of holy fasting extended far beyond the individual practitioners who literally starved themselves to death in pursuit of spiritual perfection. These extreme practices created ripple effects throughout medieval society that influenced everything from family structures and community dynamics to political decisions and cultural values. Understanding these broader social impacts reveals how a seemingly individual religious practice became a force that helped shape the medieval world. The families of holy fasters found themselves at the center of complex social, economic, and spiritual dynamics that could transform their entire lives. Having a family member who achieved recognition as a holy faster brought both tremendous opportunities and significant challenges that affected multiple generations. The immediate family benefits were often substantial. Holy fasters attracted donations from admiring believers who wanted to support the saint's family as an act of devotion. These donations could lift families out of poverty and provide economic security that would otherwise be impossible to achieve. Wealthy patrons might offer ongoing financial support, valuable gifts, or business opportunities to the families of celebrated holy people. The social status benefits were equally significant. Families of holy fasters gained immediate recognition and respect within their communities and often far beyond. They were consulted on religious matters, invited to important social events, and treated with deference that would normally be reserved for nobility. This elevated social status could provide opportunities for advantageous marriages, business partnerships, and political connections. But these benefits came with corresponding costs and responsibilities. Families had to provide constant care for their fasting relative as their physical condition deteriorated. This care was both emotionally demanding and financially expensive, requiring medical attention, special accommodations, and round-the-clock supervision. Family members often had to abandon their own work and personal goals to serve as caretakers for the holy faster. The psychological toll on families was also significant. Watching a loved one slowly waste away from self-imposed starvation was traumatic, especially when the behavior was being celebrated by outsiders who didn't witness the daily reality of physical deterioration. Family members often experienced guilt, confusion, and grief as they struggled to reconcile their personal love for their relative with the religious and social pressures to support the fasting. Children in families with holy fasters grew up in environments where extreme religious behavior was normalized and even celebrated. This could create generational patterns where subsequent family members also pursue dangerous ascetic practices in attempts to maintain the family's holy reputation. Some families developed multi-generational traditions of extreme religious behavior that persisted for centuries. The gender dynamics within these families are particularly complex. Female holy fasters often reversed traditional family power structures by becoming the most important and influential family members despite their gender. The spiritual authority could supersede normal patriarchal hierarchies, giving them decision-making power over family matters that would normally be controlled by male relatives. But this reversal of gender roles also created tensions and conflicts within families who struggled to navigate between traditional social expectations and the altered dynamics created by having a female family member with spiritual authority. Some families adapted successfully to these changes, while others were torn apart by conflicts over power, resources, and religious obligations. The community impacts of holy fasting were equally complex and far-reaching. Towns and villages with celebrated holy fasters often experienced significant economic and social changes as they adapted to accommodate the increased attention and activity generated by their local saint. Pilgrimage tourism could transform local economies almost overnight. Communities that had been isolated backwaters could suddenly find themselves on major pilgrimage routes, with hundreds or thousands of visitors arriving to seek blessings from the holy faster. This influx required rapid development of infrastructure, inns, restaurants, shops, and services to accommodate the pilgrims. Local merchants and craftspeople often benefited enormously from this pilgrimage trade. There was demand for religious souvenirs, blessed objects, food and lodging for pilgrims, and various services related to the holy person's activities. Entire industries could develop around a single holy faster, providing economic opportunities for dozens or hundreds of community members. but pilgrimage tourism also created social disruption and cultural change. Traditional community structures and relationships could be overwhelmed by the constant influx of strangers. Local religious practices might be altered to accommodate pilgrim expectations. Community leaders had to develop new systems for managing crowds, maintaining order, and protecting the holy person from overly enthusiastic devotees. The political implications were also significant. Communities with famous holy fasters often gained political influence and protection because of their spiritual importance. Rulers wanted to maintain good relationships with holy people in their communities, providing political advantages that could be crucial during conflicts or negotiations. But political involvement also created risks. Holy fasters sometimes made political statements or took sides in controversies that could anger powerful opponents. Communities could find themselves caught in the middle of political conflicts because of positions taken by their local saint. The educational and cultural impacts of holy fasting were substantial and long-lasting. The theological and philosophical questions raised by extreme fasting stimulated intellectual development and debate that contributed to the evolution of medieval religious thought. Universities and monasteries developed new approaches to evaluating mystical experiences and distinguishing between genuine spiritual insights and pathological delusions. The literary and artistic traditions that emerged around holy fasting influenced medieval culture for centuries. Hagiographies of holy fasters became popular literary genres that shaped cultural values and expectations about religious behavior. Artistic depictions of holy fasters appeared in churches, manuscripts, and other cultural productions that spread awareness of these practices far beyond their original locations. The medical and scientific implications were also significant, though often negative. The celebration of extreme fasting as spiritually beneficial discouraged the development of more rational approaches to nutrition and health. Medical practitioners who might have developed better understanding of dietary needs and eating disorders were instead encouraged to view extreme food restriction as potentially miraculous rather than pathological. The legal and institutional changes prompted by holy fasting cases also had lasting impacts. Church authorities developed new procedures for investigating claimed miracles and evaluating religious experiences. These institutional innovations influenced how the Church approached other types of extraordinary religious claims and helped establish precedents for canonization procedures that persisted for centuries. The international connections created through holy fasting also contributed to broader cultural exchange and development. Famous holy fasters attracted visitors from across Europe and beyond, creating networks of communication and cultural influence that transcended political boundaries. Ideas, practices, and innovation spread along these pilgrimage routes, contributing to the intellectual and cultural development of medieval Europe. The economic networks established through holy fasting-related pilgrimage and trade also had lasting impacts on commercial development. Communities that became pilgrimage destinations often remained important commercial centers long after their original holy person had died and been forgotten. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the influence on cultural attitudes toward women, religious authority, and the relationship between body and spirit. The success of female holy fasters in gaining spiritual authority challenged traditional gender hierarchies and provided precedents for women's religious leadership that influenced later developments in Christian history. Theological questions raised by extreme fasting about the relationship between physical suffering and spiritual advancement, the proper limits of ascetic practice, and the evaluation of mystical experiences continued to influence Christian thought long after the medieval period ended. These discussions contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to spirituality that balanced devotion with practical concern for human welfare. The cultural memory of medieval holy fasting also persisted in folklore, literature, and popular religion, continuing to influence attitudes toward fasting, asceticism, and religious devotion in subsequent centuries. Even today, the stories of medieval holy fasters continue to inspire and disturb people who struggle to understand the relationship between extreme religious devotion and mental health. Chapter 10: The Cultural Evolution of Sacred Starvation. As we delve deeper into the phenomenon of medieval holy fasting, we must examine how this practice evolved across different cultures, time periods, and religious traditions. The act of starving oneself to death in pursuit of spiritual perfection was not unique to medieval Christianity, nor did it emerge spontaneously in the Middle Ages. Instead, it represents the culmination of centuries of religious thought and cultural development that created the perfect conditions for this deadly form of devotion. The roots of religious fasting stretch back to the earliest human civilizations. Ancient Egyptian priests practiced severe dietary restrictions as part of their religious duties, believing that physical purification was necessary for spiritual communication with the gods. Greek philosophers like Pythagoras advocated fasting as a means of achieving mental clarity and spiritual insight. Jewish traditions included numerous fasting observances, from the Day of Atonement to various periods of mourning and penitence. But it was the confluence of these ancient traditions with early Christian theology that created the specific cultural framework for medieval holy fasting. The early Christian church inherited the Jewish practice of fasting but transformed it into something far more extreme and potentially deadly. The Desert Fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries established the template for Christian asceticism that would influence medieval fasting practices for over 1,000 years. These hermits retreated to the Egyptian desert not just to escape worldly temptations, but to wage active warfare against their own physical bodies. They viewed the flesh as the enemy of the spirit and starvation as a weapon in their spiritual arsenal. Saint Anthony of Egypt, whose biography by Saint Athanasius became one of the most widely read books in medieval Europe, reportedly survived on bread and water consumed only after sunset. His extreme fasting was presented not as dangerous self-harm but as evidence of supernatural strength and divine favor. When Anthony lived to be over 100 years old, despite his severe ascetic practices, it seemed to confirm that God would protect those who demonstrated such extraordinary devotion. A theological framework developed by early church fathers like St. Jerome provided intellectual justification for extreme fasting that resonated throughout the medieval period. Jerome's letters, which were copied and recopied in monasteries across Europe, contained vivid descriptions of young women who had achieved spiritual perfection through severe food restriction. In one famous letter, Jerome praised a Roman noblewoman named Blisilla who had fasted so severely that she appeared to be a shadow rather than a living person. When Blisilla died from what was almost certainly malnutrition-related complications, Jerome presented her death as a triumphant translation to heaven rather than a tragic result of self-imposed starvation. This early Christian literature created a template for holy fasting that emphasized several key themes: the body as an obstacle to spiritual development, starvation as evidence of supernatural strength, and death from fasting as martyrdom rather than suicide. These ideas would dominate medieval thinking about extreme religious behavior for centuries. The development of medieval holy fasting was also influenced by broader cultural changes in European society. The collapse of the Roman Empire and the subsequent period of social instability created conditions where traditional sources of meaning and identity were disrupted. In this chaotic environment, extreme religious behavior offered individuals a way to assert significance and purpose that transcended the brutal realities of medieval life. The rise of feudalism created a rigid social hierarchy that offered most people little hope of improving their circumstances through conventional means. Extreme religious devotion, including potentially fatal fasting, provided an alternative pathway to recognition and influence that bypassed normal social constraints. The medieval synthesis of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and Germanic cultural traditions created a unique worldview that simultaneously celebrated physical suffering and promised spiritual rewards for those willing to endure extreme hardship. This cultural framework made practices that would seem obviously pathological to modern observers appear not only reasonable but admirable. Chapter 11: The Iconography of Sacred Starvation. The visual culture of medieval Europe both reflected and reinforced the religious significance of extreme fasting. Artists, manuscript illuminators, and sculptors created powerful images that celebrated holy fasters and encouraged others to follow their example. Understanding this visual tradition helps us comprehend how medieval society normalized and promoted potentially deadly religious behavior. Medieval artistic depictions of holy fasters consistently emphasized their ethereal, otherworldly appearance. Saints who had practiced extreme fasting were typically portrayed as gaunt figures with prominent bones, sunken cheeks, and eyes that seemed to gaze beyond the physical world. These visual characteristics were not presented as signs of illness or malnutrition, but as evidence of spiritual transformation. The iconographic tradition surrounding Saint Catherine of Siena provides a perfect example of how medieval art celebrated extreme fasting. In countless paintings, sculptures, and manuscript illuminations, Catherine is depicted as an impossibly thin figure whose body seems to transcend normal physical limitations. Her emaciated appearance is contrasted with symbols of spiritual abundance, flowers, divine light, and heavenly visions that suggest her physical privation has been rewarded with supernatural gifts. One particularly striking example is a 14th century fresco in Sienna's San Domenico church that shows Catherine receiving the stigmata while appearing so thin that her body seems almost transparent. The artist has deliberately emphasized her skeletal appearance while surrounding her with golden light and heavenly figures, creating a visual message that extreme fasting leads to divine favor. Medieval manuscript illuminations frequently depicted scenes of holy women refusing food offered by concerned family members or religious authorities. These images consistently portrayed the fasters as serene and spiritually elevated, while those trying to convince them to eat appeared worldly and spiritually inferior. The visual message was clear: refusing food demonstrated superior spiritual understanding and commitment. The artistic tradition also created powerful associations between holy fasting and miraculous survival. Numerous medieval artworks show emaciated saints performing impossible feats of strength or endurance, suggesting that divine power compensated for their physical weakness. These images reinforced the belief that God would protect those who demonstrated extraordinary devotion through extreme fasting. The development of specific artistic symbols and motifs related to holy fasting created a visual vocabulary that reinforced cultural values and expectations. The communion wafer became a recurring symbol in depictions of extreme fasters, emphasizing their claim to survive on spiritual nourishment alone. Lilies and other symbols of purity frequently appeared in scenes of holy fasting, connecting food refusal with sexual chastity and spiritual cleanliness. Medieval church architecture also reflected the cultural significance of extreme fasting. Many churches contained side chapels dedicated to saints who had practiced severe food restriction, complete with altars, statues, and paintings that celebrated their ascetic achievements. These spaces provided focal points for devotion and pilgrimage that further normalized extreme fasting behavior. The artistic celebration of holy fasting was not limited to traditional religious art. Secular literature and popular culture of the medieval period also contained numerous references to extreme religious fasting that presented it as admirable and spiritually beneficial. Courtly romances frequently featured episodes where noble ladies demonstrated their spiritual superiority through severe food restriction. The troubadour tradition in medieval France produced numerous songs and poems that praised women who had achieved spiritual perfection through extreme ascetic practices. These literary works helped spread awareness of holy fasting beyond religious circles and created cultural expectations that associated female spiritual authority with severe dietary restriction. Medieval drama also incorporated themes related to holy fasting, with mystery plays and morality plays featuring characters who demonstrated their righteousness through extreme ascetic behavior. These theatrical presentations brought the message of holy fasting to audiences who might not have been exposed to formal religious instruction about ascetic practices. The visual and literary culture surrounding holy fasting created powerful psychological incentives for individuals to pursue extreme religious behavior. Young people growing up in medieval society were constantly exposed to images and stories that presented severe fasting as a path to recognition, influence, and spiritual reward. The cumulative effect of this cultural messaging was to create an environment where starving oneself to death could seem not only acceptable but admirable. The artistic tradition provided role models, reinforced theological justifications, and created social expectations that made extreme fasting appear to be a reasonable response to the spiritual challenges of medieval life. Chapter 12: Comparative Religious Perspectives on Sacred Starvation. While medieval Christianity produced some of the most extreme and well-documented examples of religious fasting unto death, similar practices existed across numerous other religious traditions. Examining these cross-cultural patterns helps us understand a broader human tendency to connect spiritual development with physical suffering and reveals both universal and culturally specific aspects of extreme religious behavior. In the Hindu tradition, the practice of prayer-based fasting unto death has ancient roots and continues to be practiced today under specific circumstances. Unlike Christian holy fasting, which was often motivated by mystical experience or spiritual purification, Hindu fasting unto death was typically undertaken by individuals who felt they had completed their earthly duties and were ready to achieve moksha liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. The Hindu scriptures provide detailed guidelines for when such fasting might be appropriate. typically requiring advanced age, the completion of all social obligations, and the absence of any desire for material gain or recognition. The practice was seen as a form of sannyasa or renunciation rather than ascetic achievement, distinguishing it from the Christian model of holy fasting. Buddhist traditions also included forms of extreme fasting, though these were generally discouraged by mainstream Buddhist teaching. The Buddha himself had practiced severe asceticism, including near starvation, before achieving enlightenment, but he subsequently taught the middle way that avoided both extreme indulgence and extreme deprivation. However, some Buddhist traditions, particularly in Japan, developed practices of Sukshinbatsu self-mummification that involved gradual self-starvation over periods of several years. These practices were undertaken by monks who sought to achieve Buddhahood through extreme ascetic discipline. The process involved progressively reducing food intake while consuming increasingly toxic substances that would preserve the body after death. The Japanese tradition of Sukshinbatsu reveals important differences from Christian holy fasting. While Christian fasters typically claimed to survive through divine intervention, Buddhist practitioners openly acknowledged that their practices would lead to death. The goal was not miraculous survival, but transformation into a different spiritual state through deliberate self-destruction. Perhaps the most relevant cross-cultural comparison to medieval Christian fasting comes from the Jain tradition of Salakkhana, also known as Santhara, which involves voluntary starvation under specific religious and ethical guidelines. This practice, which continues today despite legal controversies, provides insights into how different religious frameworks can support similar behaviors while maintaining distinct theological justifications. Jain Salakkhana is undertaken only when an individual faces terminal illness, extreme old age, or insurmountable personal crisis. The practice requires approval from religious authorities and must be motivated by spiritual purification rather than despair or worldly concerns. The gradual reduction of food and water intake is accompanied by intensive meditation and spiritual practices designed to achieve liberation at the moment of death. The Jain approach to fasting unto death differs significantly from medieval Christian practices in several important ways. First, it is highly regulated by religious law and community oversight, preventing the impulsive or pathological fasting that sometimes occurred in Christian contexts. Second, it is explicitly intended to result in death rather than miraculous survival, eliminating the element of divine intervention that characterized Christian holy fasting. The Islamic tradition has generally discouraged extreme fasting practices, though some Sufi traditions developed forms of asceticism that could become life-threatening. The Quran explicitly prohibits suicide while encouraging fasting as a spiritual discipline, creating a theological framework that supported moderate fasting while condemning extreme practices that might lead to death. However, some Sufi practitioners pushed fasting to dangerous extremes as part of their spiritual development. These practices were typically individual rather than communal and were often criticized by mainstream Islamic authorities. The tension between ascetic spirituality and religious law in Islam parallels similar debates that occurred within medieval Christianity about the appropriate limits of religious fasting. Indigenous traditions from various cultures also included forms of ritual fasting that could become life-threatening. Native American vision quests often involve extended periods without food or water, though these were typically limited in duration and conducted under community supervision. The spiritual goals of these practices, achieving visionary experiences and connecting with spiritual power, shared similarities to medieval Christian fasting while maintaining distinct cultural frameworks. The cross-cultural examination of extreme religious fasting reveals several consistent patterns. First, such practices typically emerge in religious traditions that emphasize the fundamental opposition between spiritual and material concerns. Second, they are often associated with periods of social stress or cultural transition when traditional sources of meaning and identity are disrupted. Third, they frequently serve as ways for marginalized individuals, often women, to claim spiritual authority and social recognition. These comparative perspectives also reveal the crucial role that cultural interpretation plays in determining whether extreme fasting is seen as pathological or admirable. The same behaviors that medieval Christians celebrated as evidence of sanctity might be viewed by other cultures as signs of mental illness or spiritual confusion. The contemporary global context has created new challenges for religious traditions that include extreme fasting practices. Modern medical understanding of nutrition and mental health, combined with legal frameworks that prioritize individual welfare, has created conflicts between traditional religious practices and contemporary social values. Recent legal cases involving Jane Salikonda in India illustrate these tensions. While practitioners and religious authorities argue that the practice represents legitimate religious expression protected by constitutional rights, critics contend that it violates laws against suicide and child abuse when practiced by minors. These debates reflect broader questions about the relationship between religious freedom and state authority that have implications far beyond specific fasting practices. Chapter 13: The Literary Legacy of Holy Fasting. The cultural impact of medieval holy fasting extended far beyond its immediate religious and social contexts, creating a rich literary tradition that has influenced Western culture for centuries. Understanding this literary legacy helps us comprehend how the medieval practice of starving oneself to death became embedded in broader cultural consciousness and continues to resonate in contemporary discussions of faith, identity, and bodily autonomy. Medieval hagiography, the literature of saints' lives, played a crucial role in documenting, promoting, and mythologizing extreme religious fasting. These texts, which were among the most widely read literature of the medieval period, created narrative templates that shaped cultural expectations about holy behavior and established lasting literary traditions that continue to influence modern writing. The earliest hagiographic accounts of extreme fasting established several recurring literary motifs that would persist for centuries. These included the initial resistance to fasting by family members or religious authorities, the gradual reduction of food intake accompanied by increasing spiritual experiences, miraculous events that seemed to confirm divine approval of the fasting, and ultimate death or translation to heaven presented as spiritual triumph rather than physical failure. The Life of Saint Catherine of Siena by Raymond of Capua became the archetypal hagiographic account of holy fasting, establishing narrative patterns that were replicated in countless subsequent works. Raymond's vivid descriptions of Catherine's emaciated appearance, her mystical visions, and her ultimate death from starvation created a literary model that influenced both religious and secular writing for generations. Medieval chronicles and historical accounts also contributed to the literary legacy of holy fasting by documenting its social and political impacts. These texts reveal how extreme religious fasting intersected with broader historical developments, from church reform movements to political conflicts to social upheavals that shaped medieval European society. The literary treatment of holy fasting in medieval sources reveals important cultural values and assumptions that help us understand how such extreme behavior became socially acceptable. The consistent presentation of starvation as spiritual achievement rather than self-harm reflects deeply embedded cultural beliefs about the relationship between body and soul that influenced medieval thought across numerous domains. Medieval poetry and devotional literature also incorporated themes related to extreme fasting, creating artistic works that celebrated ascetic achievement while exploring its psychological and spiritual dimensions. These texts often used elaborate metaphors comparing physical hunger to spiritual yearning, creating literary traditions that connected bodily experience with religious meaning. The troubadour tradition in medieval France produced numerous lyrical works that praised women who had achieved spiritual perfection through extreme ascetic practices. These poems helped establish literary conventions that associated female spiritual authority with severe dietary restriction, creating cultural expectations that persisted long after the medieval period ended. Medieval mystical literature, including works by practitioners of extreme fasting like Catherine of Siena and Angela of Foligno, provided first-person accounts of the psychological and spiritual experiences associated with severe food restriction. These texts offer unique insights into the subjective experience of holy fasting while revealing the theological frameworks that made such behavior seem meaningful and worthwhile. The theological writings of medieval mystics who practiced extreme fasting created distinctive literary styles that reflected their altered states of consciousness. The visionary experiences produced by starvation-induced brain chemistry changes resulted in highly symbolic, often surreal prose that influenced the development of mystical literature throughout the medieval period and beyond. The transition from medieval to Renaissance literature saw significant changes in how extreme religious fasting was portrayed and interpreted. While medieval texts typically presented holy fasting as an ambiguously positive spiritual achievement, Renaissance writers began to explore more complex and sometimes critical perspectives on extreme ascetic behavior. Renaissance humanist writers like Erasmus questioned the spiritual value of extreme fasting, arguing that such practices reflected spiritual pride rather than genuine devotion. These critiques marked the beginning of a literary tradition that viewed extreme religious behavior with skepticism and helped establish cultural attitudes that would eventually lead to the medicalization of extreme fasting behaviors. The Protestant Reformation had profound impacts on the literary treatment of holy fasting, as Reformed theologians rejected many Catholic ascetic practices as spiritually harmful or theologically incorrect. Protestant literature typically portrayed extreme fasting as evidence of Catholic superstition rather than genuine religious devotion, creating new literary traditions that emphasized spiritual moderation rather than ascetic extremism. The Counter-Reformation response to Protestant criticisms led to renewed Catholic literary interest in holy fasting, but with increased emphasis on theological sophistication and ecclesiastical authority. Post-Reformation Catholic hagiography portrayed extreme fasting as requiring careful theological evaluation and institutional oversight, reflecting the Church's increased caution about endorsing potentially dangerous religious behaviors. The Enlightenment period brought new scientific and philosophical perspectives to bear on extreme religious fasting, creating literary works that interpreted such behavior through rational rather than supernatural frameworks. Enlightenment writers often portrayed medieval holy fasters as victims of ignorance and superstition rather than as spiritual heroes, establishing literary traditions that would influence subsequent secular interpretations of religious extremism. The Gothic literary movement of the 18th and 19th centuries drew heavily on medieval themes, including extreme religious behavior like holy fasting. Gothic novels frequently featured characters whose spiritual obsessions led to physical destruction, creating literary treatments that emphasized the psychological horror of extreme religious behavior while maintaining fascination with its dramatic possibilities. The 19th century development of medical and psychological explanations for extreme fasting led to new literary approaches that portrayed such behavior as symptoms of mental illness rather than spiritual achievement. Novels and other literary works began to explore the psychological motivations behind extreme religious behavior, creating more complex and nuanced portrayals that acknowledged both the genuine spiritual yearning and the pathological aspects of extreme fasting. The emergence of feminist literary criticism in the 20th century created new interpretative frameworks for understanding medieval holy fasting, with scholars arguing that extreme ascetic behavior represented women's attempts to claim agency and authority within patriarchal religious systems. This scholarship influenced contemporary literary works that portrayed medieval holy fasters as proto-feminists rather than as victims of religious delusion. Contemporary literature continues to engage with themes related to medieval holy fasting, though typically through psychological and social rather than theological lenses. Modern novels, films, and other cultural productions often use extreme religious fasting as a metaphor for broader questions about identity, autonomy, and the relationship between individual desire and social expectation. The enduring literary legacy of medieval holy fasting reveals its continued relevance to contemporary cultural concerns. While few modern readers would accept the theological frameworks that made extreme religious fasting seem reasonable to medieval people, the underlying questions about suffering, meaning, and transcendence that motivated such behavior continue to resonate in contemporary literature and culture. Chapter 14: The Medical Revolution and the End of Sacred Starvation. The decline of holy fasting as an accepted religious practice paralleled the development of modern medical science and represented one of the most significant shifts in how European culture understood the relationship between body and spirit. This transformation reveals how scientific knowledge gradually displaced religious explanations for extreme behavior and created new frameworks for understanding the relationship between faith and physical health. The Renaissance period marked the beginning of systematic challenges to medieval assumptions about holy fasting, though these early critiques were typically theological rather than medical. Renaissance humanists questioned whether extreme ascetic practices truly demonstrated spiritual virtue or merely reflected spiritual pride and lack of proper religious instruction. The anatomical studies conducted by Renaissance physicians like Andreas Vesalius revealed the complex mechanisms of human digestion and nutrition, providing scientific frameworks that made claims about miraculous survival without food increasingly difficult to sustain. While these early medical advances did not immediately eliminate beliefs about holy fasting, they began to create intellectual frameworks that would eventually challenge supernatural explanations for extreme ascetic behavior. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries accelerated the development of rational approaches to understanding extreme religious behavior. Scientists like William Harvey, whose work on blood circulation revealed the body's dependence on adequate nutrition, created new models of human physiology that made miraculous survival without food seem increasingly implausible. The development of systematic clinical observation during the 17th and 18th centuries led to more careful documentation of extreme fasting cases, revealing patterns that suggested natural rather than supernatural explanations. Physicians began to identify specific symptoms and progression patterns in extreme fasting cases that resembled other medical conditions rather than miraculous phenomena. The Enlightenment emphasis on rational explanation and empirical evidence created cultural attitudes that were increasingly skeptical of supernatural claims, including those related to holy fasting. Enlightenment philosophers argued that extreme religious behavior reflected ignorance and superstition rather than genuine spiritual insight, creating intellectual frameworks that would eventually lead to medical rather than theological interpretations of extreme fasting. The 18th century development of chemistry as a scientific discipline provided new understanding of human metabolism and nutrition that made the physiological impossibility of long-term survival without food increasingly clear. Chemical analysis of food and human metabolism revealed the specific ways that the body required regular nutrition to maintain essential functions. The emergence of psychiatry as a medical discipline in the 19th century created new frameworks for understanding extreme religious behavior, including holy fasting. Early psychiatrists like Philippe Pinel and Jean-Tine Dominique Esquirol identified patterns of behavior that they classified as religious mania or other forms of mental illness, moving the interpretation of extreme fasting from the theological to the medical realm. The 19th century documentation of anorexia nervosa as a specific medical condition by physicians like William Gull and Charles Lusk provided clinical frameworks that could explain extreme fasting behavior without reference to supernatural intervention. These medical models emphasize the psychological and physiological mechanisms underlying food refusal rather than its potential spiritual significance. The development of modern nutrition science in the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided detailed understanding of the specific nutritional requirements for human survival and the progressive physiological changes that occurred during starvation. This scientific knowledge made it increasingly difficult to maintain beliefs about miraculous survival without food. The emergence of psychoanalysis and other forms of depth psychology created new explanatory frameworks for extreme religious behavior that emphasized unconscious psychological motivations rather than spiritual experiences. Freudian and other psychological theories provided alternative explanations for the visions, ecstasies, and other extraordinary experiences associated with extreme fasting. The 20th century development of modern medical imaging and laboratory testing made it possible to document the specific physiological changes that occurred during extreme fasting, providing objective evidence that contradicted claims about miraculous survival. Medical monitoring could now reveal the progressive organ damage and metabolic dysfunction that accompanied severe food restriction. The establishment of modern medical ethics and patient care standards created legal and professional obligations that made it increasingly difficult for medical practitioners to ignore the health consequences of extreme fasting. Physicians became legally obligated to intervene in cases of potentially life-threatening food restriction, regardless of the patient's religious motivations. The development of modern psychiatry and psychology created new diagnostic categories that medicalized behaviors that had previously been interpreted as religious phenomena. Extreme fasting was increasingly understood as a symptom of mental illness rather than a legitimate form of spiritual expression, fundamentally changing cultural attitudes towards such behavior. The 20th century women's rights movement created new perspectives on female religious behavior that emphasized the social and psychological constraints that had historically limited women's options. Feminist scholars argued that extreme religious fasting represented women's responses to oppressive social conditions rather than genuine spiritual calling. The contemporary understanding of eating disorders as serious medical conditions requiring professional treatment has created frameworks that prioritize physical and psychological health over religious interpretation. Modern medical and psychological approaches emphasize the importance of intervention and treatment rather than acceptance or celebration of extreme fasting behavior. The globalization of medical knowledge and the establishment of international health standards have created challenges for traditional religious practices that involve extreme fasting. Legal and medical authorities increasingly view such practices as forms of self-harm that require intervention, regardless of their religious significance. The contemporary tension between religious freedom and medical intervention reflects ongoing cultural struggles over the appropriate limits of faith-based practices. Legal systems must balance respect for religious diversity with protection of individual health and welfare, creating complex ethical and legal challenges. The modern medical understanding of extreme fasting has not completely eliminated religious interpretations of such behavior, but it has fundamentally changed the cultural context in which such practices occur. Contemporary religious communities must navigate between traditional spiritual values and modern medical knowledge, creating new forms of religious expression that acknowledge scientific understanding while maintaining spiritual significance. Chapter 15: Contemporary Echoes and Modern Implications. The phenomenon of medieval holy fasting may seem like a distant historical curiosity, but its echoes continue to resonate in contemporary culture in ways that reveal persistent human struggles with questions of faith, identity, autonomy, and the relationship between physical and spiritual well-being. Understanding these modern manifestations helps us appreciate both the historical specificity of medieval practices and their enduring relevance to contemporary human experience. The modern eating disorder of anorexia nervosa shares striking behavioral similarities with medieval holy fasting, though the cultural frameworks for interpreting these behaviors have changed dramatically. Contemporary anorexics, like medieval holy fasters, often demonstrate extraordinary self-control over food intake, experience altered states of consciousness, and claim to find spiritual or psychological benefits in their restriction behaviors. However, modern medical and psychological frameworks interpret these behaviors as symptoms of mental illness requiring treatment rather than as legitimate forms of spiritual expression. This shift reflects broader cultural changes in how we understand the relationship between mind, body, and spirit, but it also raises complex questions about the boundaries between pathology and authentic spiritual experience. The contemporary pro-ana movement, which promotes anorexic behaviors through online communities and social media, reveals how modern technology can recreate some of the social dynamics that supported medieval holy fasting. Like medieval communities that celebrated extreme fasters, pro-ana communities provide social validation and encouragement for potentially deadly behaviors, creating support systems that enable and reinforce dangerous food restriction practices. The persistence of extreme religious fasting in contemporary religious communities demonstrates the continued appeal of using physical deprivation as a form of spiritual expression. Various Christian denominations, Islamic Sufi traditions, Hindu ascetic practices, and other religious movements continue to include forms of extreme fasting that can become life-threatening, though these are typically more regulated and monitored than their medieval predecessors. Contemporary hunger strikes as forms of political protest share important characteristics with medieval holy fasting, including the use of food refusal as a form of moral communication and the willingness to risk death to achieve higher purposes. Political hunger strikers, like medieval holy fasters, used their bodies as instruments of moral persuasion and claimed that their physical suffering serves transcendent goals. The modern legal and ethical frameworks that govern responses to hunger strikes reveal ongoing tensions between respect for individual autonomy and protection of human life. Courts and medical institutions must balance competing values when deciding whether to force-feed hunger strikers or allow them to continue potentially fatal fasting, echoing medieval debates about the appropriate limits of religious expression. The contemporary wellness culture's emphasis on fasting, cleansing, and dietary restriction often draws on spiritual and purification themes that echo medieval religious fasting. While modern fasting practices are typically presented in medical or psychological rather than theological terms, they often incorporate ideas about achieving higher states of consciousness or spiritual purification through dietary restriction. The popular appeal of intermittent fasting, juice cleanses, and other forms of voluntary food restriction reveals persistent cultural associations between dietary control and moral virtue. These practices often promise not only physical health benefits, but also psychological and spiritual transformation, suggesting continuities with medieval beliefs about the spiritual significance of food restriction. The modern fitness and diet culture's celebration of extreme dietary control and the achievement of unrealistic body standards shares important psychological dynamics with medieval holy fasting. Both phenomena involve the use of food restriction to achieve social recognition and personal identity, though the cultural frameworks and stated goals are dramatically different. Contemporary discussions of religious exemptions from medical treatment often invoke similar questions to those raised by medieval holy fasting about the appropriate limits of faith-based practices. Legal systems must determine when religious beliefs justify behavior that appears harmful or irrational, creating ongoing tensions between religious freedom and state authority. The modern medical and psychological understanding of the relationship between nutrition and mental health has revealed connections between dietary practices and psychological states that help explain some of the experiences reported by medieval holy fasters. Research on the neurochemical effects of fasting has shown that food restriction can indeed produce altered states of consciousness and feelings of transcendence, though these are now understood as physiological rather than supernatural phenomena. The contemporary feminist analysis of medieval holy fasting has created new interpretive frameworks that emphasize the ways that extreme religious behavior could serve as a form of resistance against oppressive social conditions. These perspectives suggest that medieval holy fasters may have been responding to limited opportunities for female agency and authority rather than simply pursuing spiritual goals. The modern recovery movement's emphasis on personal transformation for acceptance of powerlessness and surrender to higher powers shows interesting parallels with medieval holy fasting spirituality. Both involve the voluntary relinquishment of personal control in service of transcendent goals, though the specific practices and outcomes are quite different. Contemporary therapeutic approaches to eating disorders often struggle with cases where individuals claim spiritual or religious motivations for their food restriction behaviors. Mental health professionals must navigate between respecting clients' spiritual beliefs and addressing potentially life-threatening symptoms, creating complex ethical and clinical challenges. The modern study of religious experience and altered states of consciousness has provided new frameworks for understanding the extraordinary experiences reported by medieval holy fasters. Research on meditation, fasting, and other spiritual practices has revealed the neurological mechanisms underlying mystical experiences while also validating their significance for practitioners. The contemporary global context has created new challenges for traditional religious practices that involve extreme fasting. International human rights frameworks and medical standards have created legal and ethical constraints on practices that were historically accepted within specific religious communities, leading to cultural conflicts and legal controversies. The modern understanding of child development and protection has made contemporary versions of medieval holy fasting particularly controversial when they involve minors. Legal systems now recognize children's rights to protection from harmful religious practices, creating conflicts with traditional religious authorities who may view such practices as legitimate spiritual training. The contemporary mental health awareness movement has increased recognition of the psychological factors that may motivate extreme religious behavior, creating more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between spiritual seeking and psychological distress. This knowledge has led to more nuanced approaches to addressing extreme religious practices that acknowledge both their potential spiritual significance and their psychological risks. The modern technological capacity to monitor and document the physiological effects of extreme fasting has made it increasingly difficult to maintain claims about miraculous survival without food. Medical monitoring can now provide objective evidence about the health consequences of severe food restriction, creating scientific constraints on religious interpretations of extreme fasting. The enduring fascination with medieval holy fasting in contemporary literature, film, and popular culture reveals the continued relevance of questions about suffering, transcendence, and the limits of human endurance. These cultural productions often use historical examples of extreme religious behavior to explore contemporary questions about identity, autonomy, and the search for meaning in secular contexts. Conclusion: the eternal questions behind sacred starvation. As we conclude our comprehensive examination of medieval holy fasting, we must recognize that this historical phenomenon raises fundamental questions about human nature, spirituality, and the relationship between body and soul that remain relevant today. While the specific cultural frameworks that made starving oneself to death seem like a reasonable spiritual practice have largely disappeared, the underlying human drives and concerns that motivated such behavior continue to manifest in various forms. The medieval practitioners of holy fasting were responding to universal human experiences, the search for meaning and purpose, the desire for transcendence and connection with the divine, the need for autonomy and agency in constrained circumstances, and the struggle to find identity and recognition in challenging social environments. These concerns persist in contemporary life, though they typically express themselves through different practices and within different cultural frameworks. The tragedy of medieval holy fasting lies not in the spiritual seeking that motivated it, but in the cultural and theological frameworks that channel legitimate human needs into potentially deadly behaviors. The individuals who starved themselves to death in pursuit of holiness were often responding to genuine spiritual callings and authentic desires for transcendence, but they lived in societies that provided few safe or sustainable ways to pursue these goals. Understanding medieval holy fasting helps us appreciate both the historical specificity of past religious practices and the enduring relevance of the human experiences they addressed. While we may reject the specific behaviors that characterize medieval extreme fasting, we can recognize and honor the spiritual hunger that drove people to such extremes. The contemporary challenge is to create cultural and religious frameworks that acknowledge and support authentic spiritual seeking while protecting individuals from harmful practices. This requires balancing respect for religious diversity and individual autonomy with commitment to human welfare and protection of vulnerable populations. The legacy of medieval holy fasting reminds us that the relationship between faith and practice, between spiritual aspiration and physical expression, requires careful attention and ongoing evaluation. Religious communities and societies more broadly must remain vigilant about the potential for authentic spiritual seeking to become channeled into harmful or destructive behaviors. The scientific understanding we have gained about nutrition, psychology, and human development provides us with tools that medieval people lacked for evaluating the health consequences of extreme religious practices. This knowledge creates both opportunities and obligations to develop more sophisticated approaches to supporting spiritual development while protecting human welfare. The story of medieval holy fasting ultimately teaches us about the power of cultural frameworks to shape individual behavior and the importance of creating societies that provide meaningful ways for people to pursue transcendence, purpose, and identity without risking their lives or well-being. It reminds us that human beings have always sought connection with something greater than themselves, and that this seeking requires wisdom, compassion, and careful attention to both its potential benefits and its possible dangers. As we face contemporary challenges related to mental health, religious extremism, and the search for meaning in secular societies, the medieval experience of holy fasting provides valuable lessons about the complex relationship between individual psychology, cultural values, and spiritual practice. By understanding this history, we can better address the persistent human needs that it represents while avoiding the tragic outcomes that it often produced. The medieval holy fasters were not merely victims of ignorance or superstition, but human beings responding to profound spiritual and psychological needs within the limitations of their historical context. Their stories remind us of both the nobility of human spiritual seeking and the importance of creating wise and compassionate frameworks for supporting that seeking in ways that honor both our deepest aspirations and our fundamental humanity. Their legacy challenges us to continue the ongoing work of creating societies that provide meaningful paths for spiritual development, personal growth, and transcendent experience while protecting the vulnerable and maintaining commitment to human flourishing. In this way, the tragic beauty of medieval holy fasting can continue to teach and inspire us, not through imitation of its practices, but through deeper understanding of the eternal human questions it sought to address. Chapter 16. Modern medicine confronts sacred starvation. As we enter the final phase of our exploration into medieval holy fasting, we must examine how modern medical and psychological understanding has completely transformed our comprehension of these practices. The scientific revolution that began in the Renaissance and culminated in contemporary medical knowledge has created frameworks that allow us to understand the physiological and psychological mechanisms behind behaviors that medieval people could only interpret through religious lenses. The development of modern psychiatry in the 19th and 20th centuries provided the first systematic attempts to understand extreme religious behavior through medical rather than theological frameworks. Pioneers like Jean-Martin Charcot and Sigmund Freud began to identify patterns in extreme religious behavior that suggested psychological rather than spiritual origins, though their early theories were often as speculative as the religious explanations they sought to replace. Charcot's work on hysteria at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris revealed striking similarities between medieval accounts of religious ecstasy and contemporary cases of what we now understand as conversion disorders. His detailed documentation of patients who exhibited dramatic physical symptoms without apparent organic cause provided early evidence that extreme religious experiences might have psychological rather than supernatural origins. Freud's psychoanalytic theories, whatever their limitations, offered new frameworks for understanding the unconscious motivations behind extreme religious behavior. His analysis of religious experience as sublimated sexual energy and his theories about the role of repression in creating psychological symptoms provided alternative explanations for behaviors that had previously been understood only in religious terms. The emergence of modern nutritional science in the early 20th century provided detailed understanding of the physiological effects of starvation that medieval people could never have comprehended. Research by scientists like Ancel Keys, whose Minnesota starvation experiment during World War II documented the psychological and physical effects of severe caloric restriction, revealed the specific mechanisms by which prolonged fasting affects brain chemistry and behavior. Key's study demonstrated that starvation produces predictable psychological changes including depression, anxiety, irritability, and obsessive thoughts about food. Participants also reported vivid dreams, difficulty concentrating, and altered perceptions that bear striking resemblances to the mystical experiences reported by medieval holy fasters. Most significantly, the study showed that these effects occurred regardless of participants' religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds, suggesting that they resulted from physiological rather than spiritual causes. Modern neuroscience has revealed the specific brain chemistry changes that occur during prolonged fasting. Research has shown that starvation affects neurotransmitter systems including serotonin, dopamine, and GABA in ways that can produce hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and feelings of transcendence. These findings provide scientific explanations for experiences that medieval people naturally interpreted as divine communications. The discovery of endogenous opioids and their role in the brain's response to stress and starvation has provided additional insights into the mechanisms behind holy fasting. The body's natural production of opiate-like compounds during extreme physical stress can create feelings of euphoria and transcendence that help explain why some individuals found extreme fasting psychologically rewarding despite its obvious physical dangers. Contemporary research on eating disorders has revealed striking parallels between modern anorexia nervosa and medieval holy fasting, while also highlighting crucial differences in cultural context and interpretation. Both phenomena involve extreme restriction of food intake, distorted relationships with food and eating, and psychological experiences that practitioners find meaningful despite obvious health risks. However, modern eating disorder research has also revealed the complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to extreme eating behaviors. Genetic predisposition, brain chemistry abnormalities, psychological trauma, and cultural pressures all play roles in developing eating disorders, suggesting that medieval holy fasting may have represented similar complex interactions between individual vulnerability and cultural environment. The development of modern cognitive psychology has provided new understanding of the mental processes involved in extreme religious behavior. Research on cognitive biases, motivated reasoning, and the psychology of belief has revealed how individuals can maintain dangerous behaviors by selectively interpreting evidence and rationalizing harmful choices through religious or spiritual frameworks. Contemporary understanding of social psychology has also illuminated the group dynamics that supported medieval holy fasting. Research on conformity, social influence, and group identity has shown how communities can collectively support and reinforce behaviors that would seem obviously harmful to outside observers. These insights help explain how entire medieval communities could celebrate and encourage practices that we now recognize as potentially deadly. Modern medical ethics has created frameworks for evaluating religious practices that pose health risks, though these frameworks continue to evolve as societies struggle to balance respect for religious freedom with protection of individual welfare. The principles of informed consent, beneficence, and non-maleficence that guide contemporary medical practice create ethical obligations that would have been incomprehensible to medieval practitioners. Contemporary bioethics must grapple with complex questions about when medical intervention is appropriate in cases involving religious beliefs. While modern physicians have clear obligations to preserve life and health, they must also respect patients' autonomy and religious convictions, creating challenging ethical dilemmas when these principles conflict. The World Health Organization and other international health bodies have developed guidelines for addressing cultural and religious practices that pose health risks, though implementation remains controversial and culturally sensitive. These guidelines attempt to balance respect for cultural diversity with protection of human rights and health, creating frameworks that would have been unimaginable in medieval times. Chapter 17. Contemporary parallels the modern face of sacred starvation. While the specific cultural and theological frameworks that supported medieval holy fasting have largely disappeared, contemporary society continues to produce phenomena that bear striking resemblances to these historical practices. Understanding these modern parallels helps us appreciate both the historical specificity of medieval holy fasting and the enduring human tendencies that it represented. Modern anorexia nervosa represents perhaps the most obvious parallel to medieval holy fasting, though the cultural context and stated motivations are dramatically different. Contemporary anorexics, like medieval holy fasters, demonstrate extraordinary self-control over food intake, often express feelings of spiritual or psychological transcendence related to their restriction behaviors, and frequently resist treatment despite obvious health consequences. However, modern anorexia typically develops within secular frameworks emphasizing body image, control, and personal achievement rather than religious devotion. Contemporary anorexics often describe their restriction behaviors in terms of discipline, purity, and self-improvement rather than divine communication or spiritual advancement, reflecting the secular values that dominate modern culture. The pro-honor movement that has emerged in online communities reveals how modern technology can recreate some of the social dynamics that supported medieval holy fasting. These online communities provide validation, encouragement, and practical advice for maintaining dangerous eating behaviors, creating virtual support systems that parallel the communities that celebrated medieval holy fasters. Like medieval religious communities that interpreted extreme fasting as evidence of spiritual advancement, pro-honor communities often frame anorexic behaviors as demonstrations of superior self-control and dedication. They develop elaborate philosophies and practices around food restriction that provide meaning and identity for participants, though these are typically presented in psychological or aesthetic rather than religious terms. Contemporary fitness and diet culture often exhibits characteristics that echo medieval attitudes toward food and the body. The popular emphasis on clean eating, detoxification, and extreme dietary restriction sometimes takes on quasi-religious dimensions that bear similarities to medieval ascetic practices. Modern wellness culture frequently incorporates spiritual or mystical elements into dietary practices, promising not only physical health but also psychological and spiritual benefits from various forms of fasting or restriction. These practices often draw on Eastern religious traditions or New Age spirituality to provide frameworks for understanding dietary restriction as a path to higher consciousness or spiritual development. The contemporary fascination with intermittent fasting, extended fasting, and cleansing diets reveals persistent cultural associations between food restriction and moral virtue. While these practices are typically presented in scientific or medical terms, they often incorporate ideas about purification, discipline, and transcendence that echo medieval religious fasting. Some modern religious communities continue to practice forms of extreme fasting that can become life-threatening, though these are typically more regulated and monitored than their medieval predecessors. Various Christian denominations, Islamic Sufi traditions, Hindu ascetic practices, and Buddhist monastic communities include forms of fasting that can approach dangerous extremes. Contemporary religious fasting practices often struggle to balance traditional spiritual values with modern medical knowledge and legal requirements. Religious authorities must navigate between maintaining authentic spiritual traditions and preventing harmful outcomes, creating tensions that parallel medieval debates about the appropriate limits of religious practice. The Jain practice of Salikana fasting under death continues in contemporary India, creating ongoing legal and ethical controversies that illuminate the persistent tensions between religious freedom and state authority. Recent legal cases involving Salikana have raised fundamental questions about religious rights, medical intervention, and the role of government in regulating potentially harmful religious practices. Modern hunger strikes as forms of political protest share important psychological and social dynamics with medieval holy fasting. Political hunger strikers, like medieval holy fasters, use food refusal as a form of moral communication, claiming that their physical suffering serves transcendent political or social goals. Contemporary hunger strikes often involve complex negotiations between strikers, authorities, and medical professionals about the limits of autonomy and the obligations of the state to preserve life. These negotiations reflect ongoing struggles to balance individual rights with collective welfare that parallel medieval debates about religious authority and personal choice. The modern body positive movement has created new frameworks for understanding the relationship between food, body image, and identity that both challenge and sometimes inadvertently replicate patterns associated with eating disorders. While generally promoting healthy attitudes toward food and body image, some aspects of contemporary body politics can develop rigid orthodoxies that parallel the ideological frameworks that supported medieval extreme practices. Contemporary social media culture has created new forms of performance and validation around food and eating behaviors that can both promote and potentially exacerbate disordered eating patterns. The ability to document and share dietary choices online creates opportunities for both positive support and dangerous enablement of extreme behaviors. Modern therapeutic approaches to eating disorders have developed sophisticated understanding of the psychological functions that food restriction can serve, including needs for control, identity, meaning, and transcendence. These insights help explain why both medieval holy fasting and contemporary eating disorders can be so resistant to intervention despite obvious health risks. Contemporary addiction treatment and recovery communities often incorporate spiritual elements that echo aspects of medieval religious practice, though typically within more psychologically sophisticated frameworks. The emphasis on surrender, higher powers, and spiritual transformation in 12-step programs reflects persistent human needs for meaning and transcendence that found expression in medieval holy fasting. The modern mindfulness and meditation movements often incorporate fasting or dietary restriction as components of spiritual practice, though typically with greater awareness of potential risks and more sophisticated approaches to monitoring and modification. These practices attempt to preserve the spiritual benefits of traditional ascetic practices while minimizing their dangers. Chapter 18: Legal and Ethical Challenges in the Modern World. The persistence of extreme religious fasting practices in contemporary society has created complex legal and ethical challenges that reveal ongoing tensions between religious freedom, individual autonomy, and state authority. Modern legal systems must balance competing values and principles when addressing practices that claim religious legitimacy but pose apparent risks to health and welfare. Contemporary legal frameworks typically recognize broad rights to religious freedom while also establishing state obligations to protect public health and individual welfare. These competing principles create challenging cases when religious practices appear to threaten the health or lives of practitioners, requiring courts and legislators to make difficult judgments about the appropriate limits of religious expression. The case of Jain Salakana in India exemplifies these contemporary legal challenges. While this practice of voluntary fasting unto death has ancient religious roots and continues to be practiced by some Jain communities, it has faced increasing legal scrutiny in modern India. Critics argue that Salakana violates laws against suicide and constitutes a form of harm that the state has an obligation to prevent. Defenders of Salakana argue that it represents a legitimate religious practice protected by constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. They contend that the practice is fundamentally different from suicide because it is motivated by spiritual rather than desperate purposes and is conducted according to strict religious guidelines that ensure it represents a genuine spiritual choice rather than a response to depression or coercion. The Indian courts have struggled to develop consistent approaches to Salakana cases, sometimes allowing the practice to continue when conducted by adults with apparent mental capacity and religious conviction, while intervening in cases involving minors or individuals whose competence appears questionable. These legal decisions reflect ongoing attempts to balance religious rights with protective obligations. Similar tensions arise in Western legal systems when religious communities practice forms of extreme fasting that approach dangerous levels. While most Western countries provide strong protections for religious freedom, they also establish legal obligations for medical intervention when individuals appear to be at risk of serious harm or death. The medical profession faces particular ethical challenges when treating patients whose religious beliefs lead them to refuse potentially life-saving interventions. Contemporary medical ethics emphasizes both the obligation to preserve life and health and the requirement to respect patient autonomy and religious convictions. These principles can create irreconcilable conflicts when patients' religious beliefs lead them to reject medical advice or treatment. Medical professionals treating patients with religiously motivated eating restrictions must navigate between respecting patients' spiritual beliefs and fulfilling their professional obligations to promote health and prevent harm. This requires sophisticated understanding of both medical and religious issues, as well as careful attention to legal and ethical boundaries. Contemporary bioethics has developed frameworks for addressing these challenges, including principles of informed consent that require patients to understand the medical consequences of their choices, and guidelines for determining when individuals have the mental capacity to make autonomous decisions about their own health care. The legal treatment of eating disorders in contemporary society reveals additional complexities in balancing individual autonomy with protective obligations. While eating disorders are generally understood as medical conditions requiring treatment, legal systems must still grapple with questions about when involuntary intervention is appropriate and how to balance respect for individual choice with protection of vulnerable individuals. Family members and communities affected by extreme religious fasting practices face their own legal and ethical challenges. Parents whose children practice dangerous forms of religious fasting may face charges of child abuse or neglect, even when they believe they are supporting legitimate religious expression. Communities that encourage or enable extreme fasting practices may face legal liability for harmful outcomes. The development of international human rights law has created additional frameworks for addressing religious practices that pose health risks. International human rights instruments typically recognize both religious freedom and the right to health, requiring states to balance these potentially competing rights when developing domestic policies and laws. Contemporary child protection laws create particular challenges for religious communities that include fasting practices as part of their traditions. While parents generally have broad rights to make decisions about their children's religious education and practice, these rights are limited when practices appear to pose risks to children's health and development. Legal systems must also address questions about the age at which individuals can make autonomous decisions about participating in potentially dangerous religious practices. While adults are generally presumed to have the right to make decisions about their own religious practice, even when these decisions appear harmful, minors are typically afforded additional protections that can limit their participation in dangerous practices. The enforcement of laws protecting individuals from harmful religious practices remains challenging, particularly when practices occur within closed or insular religious communities. Law enforcement and social service agencies may lack the cultural knowledge or access necessary to identify and address harmful practices, while community members may be reluctant to report practices they view as legitimate religious expression. Contemporary legal systems have also had to develop approaches to cases involving religious practices from other cultures or legal traditions. Immigration and multiculturalism have brought practices that may be legal and accepted in some countries but prohibited in others, requiring legal systems to balance cultural sensitivity with consistent application of domestic law. The role of religious authorities in preventing or enabling harmful religious practices creates additional legal and ethical questions. While religious leaders generally have broad freedom to teach and interpret religious doctrine, they may face legal consequences if their teachings directly encourage or facilitate harmful behaviors. Professional licensing boards for medical and mental health practitioners have developed ethical guidelines for addressing religious and cultural factors and treatment, while also maintaining professional obligations to promote health and prevent harm. These guidelines attempt to provide practical frameworks for navigating complex cases involving religious beliefs and medical treatment. Chapter 19: Psychological Insights into Sacred Starvation. Modern psychological research has provided unprecedented insights into the mental processes and social dynamics that made medieval holy fasting possible and sustainable. Understanding these psychological mechanisms helps explain both the historical phenomenon itself and its contemporary parallels, while also revealing broader truths about human psychology, spirituality, and social behavior. Contemporary research on eating disorders has identified numerous psychological factors that can motivate extreme food restriction behaviors. These include needs for control, perfectionism, low self-esteem, trauma responses, and various forms of psychological distress. Many of these same factors likely contributed to medieval holy fasting, though they were interpreted through religious rather than psychological frameworks. The psychology of control plays a particularly important role in understanding extreme fasting behaviors. Research has shown that food restriction can provide individuals with a sense of mastery and autonomy, particularly when other aspects of life feel chaotic or uncontrollable. For medieval women whose lives were severely constrained by social and legal restrictions, extreme fasting may have represented one of the few domains where they could exercise meaningful control. Modern understanding of perfectionism reveals another psychological mechanism that likely contributed to medieval holy fasting. Perfectionistic individuals often set unrealistic standards for themselves and experience intense distress when they fail to meet these standards. Medieval religious culture, with its emphasis on spiritual perfection and the impossibility of achieving complete holiness, created ideal conditions for perfectionism to manifest in extreme ascetic behaviors. Research on trauma and its psychological effects has shown that individuals who have experienced various forms of trauma may develop coping mechanisms that appear harmful to outside observers but serve important psychological functions for the individuals involved. Many medieval holy fasters likely experienced various forms of trauma, including physical abuse, sexual violence, family disruption, or other adverse experiences that might have contributed to their adoption of extreme religious practices as coping mechanisms. The psychology of meaning-making reveals how individuals can maintain seemingly irrational behaviors by embedding them within larger frameworks of meaning and significance. Medieval holy fasters were able to sustain dangerous behaviors because they understood them as serving transcendent spiritual purposes, providing meaning and identity that compensated for the obvious physical costs. Contemporary research on religious experience and spirituality has identified specific psychological mechanisms that can produce the types of transcendent experiences reported by medieval holy fasters. These include altered states of consciousness produced by various factors including nutrition, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and intense focus or meditation. The psychology of group dynamics provides insights into how communities could collectively support and reinforce potentially dangerous behaviors. Research on conformity, groupthink, and social influence reveals how group pressure and social validation can lead individuals to engage in behaviors they might otherwise avoid. Medieval communities that celebrated extreme fasting created social environments that powerfully reinforced these behaviors. Modern understanding of charismatic authority and cult dynamics offers additional perspectives on how religious leaders could encourage and maintain extreme practices among their followers. The psychology of authority, influence, and persuasion reveals how powerful leaders could convince followers to engage in behaviors that served the leader's interests rather than the followers' welfare. Research on cognitive biases and motivated reasoning explains how individuals can maintain beliefs and behaviors despite contradictory evidence. Medieval holy fasters could ignore obvious signs of physical deterioration by selectively attending to information that supported their religious interpretations while dismissing or reinterpreting contradictory evidence. The psychology of identity formation reveals how extreme behaviors can serve important psychological functions related to self-concept and social belonging. For medieval individuals with limited options for developing meaningful identities, extreme religious practices could provide distinctive roles that offered both personal significance and social recognition. Contemporary research on the psychology of suffering has identified various psychological functions that voluntary suffering can serve, including meaning-making, identity formation, social bonding, and spiritual development. These insights help explain why medieval holy fasters were willing to endure obvious physical discomfort in pursuit of less tangible psychological and spiritual benefits. Modern understanding of attachment theory provides additional insights into the psychological origins of extreme religious behavior. Individuals with insecure attachment patterns may be more likely to seek intense spiritual relationships as substitutes for human connections, potentially leading to extreme religious practices that appear to strengthen their relationship with the divine. The psychology of altered states of consciousness has revealed that various techniques including fasting, sleep deprivation, sensory deprivation, and repetitive activities can produce profound changes in perception and experience. Medieval holy fasters likely used these techniques, whether consciously or unconsciously, to produce the spiritual experiences that reinforce their extreme behaviors. Research on the psychology of self-control and willpower has shown that extreme restraint in one domain can produce psychological effects that extend to other areas of life. Medieval holy fasters may have experienced enhanced feelings of self-efficacy and spiritual power as a result of their extraordinary self-control over food intake, creating positive feedback loops that encourage continued extreme behavior. Contemporary understanding of the psychology of addiction has revealed that behaviors can become compulsive and difficult to change even when they produce obvious negative consequences. Some aspects of medieval holy fasting may have involved addictive processes related to the psychological and physiological effects of starvation, making it difficult for practitioners to moderate their behaviors even when they recognize potential risks. Chapter 20: The Cultural Construction of Sacred Starvation. Understanding medieval holy fasting requires recognizing how cultural frameworks shape individual psychology and behavior in ways that can make seemingly irrational practices appear not only reasonable but admirable. The cultural construction of reality is so powerful that it can lead entire societies to celebrate behaviors that other cultures would view as obviously harmful or pathological. Medieval European culture created a unique synthesis of religious, philosophical, and social elements that provided powerful justifications for extreme ascetic practices. The combination of Christian theology, classical philosophy, Germanic warrior culture, and feudal social structures created cultural frameworks that celebrated suffering, distrusted physical pleasure, and promised spiritual rewards for extreme self-denial. The medieval Christian emphasis on the fundamental opposition between flesh and spirit created theological frameworks that made extreme bodily mortification seem spiritually beneficial. This dualistic worldview, influenced by Platonic philosophy and Gnostic traditions, taught that the physical body was an obstacle to spiritual development that needed to be conquered through disciplined denial of its needs and desires. Medieval gender constructions played crucial roles in shaping expectations and opportunities around religious expression. Women were excluded from most forms of religious authority and had limited options for demonstrating spiritual devotion. Extreme fasting provided one of the few pathways through which medieval women could claim religious authority and social recognition, making dangerous practices appear to be rational responses to limited opportunities. The medieval social hierarchy created conditions of powerlessness and subordination for the vast majority of the population that made extreme religious practices psychologically appealing. For individuals with little control over their material circumstances, extreme fasting could provide a sense of agency and significance that was otherwise unavailable. Medieval economic conditions, including frequent famines and chronic food insecurity, created cultural attitudes toward eating and hunger that were fundamentally different from modern perspectives. In a society where most people experienced regular hunger, voluntary starvation could be interpreted as demonstrating supernatural strength rather than pathological behavior. The medieval honor culture, with its emphasis on courage, endurance, and willingness to suffer for higher purposes, provided additional cultural support for extreme ascetic practices. Just as medieval warriors gained honor through their willingness to endure pain and risk death in battle, holy fasters could gain spiritual honor through their willingness to endure suffering in pursuit of religious goals. Medieval concepts of time and progress were fundamentally different from modern perspectives, creating cultural frameworks that supported long-term suffering in pursuit of ultimate rewards. Medieval people understood life as a brief preparation for eternity, making temporary physical suffering seem insignificant compared to eternal spiritual benefits. The medieval legal system's emphasis on public punishment and display created cultural norms that celebrated visible suffering as demonstration of virtue or justice. In a society where punishment was designed to be as public and spectacular as possible, extreme religious suffering could be understood as admirable display rather than pathological behavior. Medieval medical theory, based on the humoral system and other pre-scientific concepts, actually provided pseudoscientific justifications for practices that we now understand as harmful. Medieval physicians could interpret extreme fasting as therapeutically beneficial, providing medical as well as religious support for dangerous practices. The medieval communication system, based on oral tradition and manuscript transmission, created conditions where extraordinary stories could be embellished and mythologized over time. Accounts of holy fasters were often edited and enhanced to emphasize their supernatural aspects while minimizing or ignoring their tragic outcomes. Medieval artistic and literary traditions created powerful visual and narrative representations of holy fasters that reinforced cultural values and expectations. The constant exposure to images and stories celebrating extreme ascetic practices created cultural environments where such behaviors seemed normal and admirable rather than aberrant. The medieval church's institutional needs for examples of extraordinary holiness created organizational incentives for promoting extreme religious practices. Church authorities could use accounts of holy fasters to demonstrate the superiority of Christian spirituality, while also providing role models that encouraged religious devotion among ordinary believers. Medieval pilgrimage culture created economic and social incentives for communities to promote local holy figures, including extreme fasters. Towns and villages that could claim famous religious figures could attract pilgrims and their economic contributions, creating financial motivations for supporting and publicizing extreme religious practices. The medieval intellectual tradition's emphasis on authority rather than empirical observation meant that once extreme fasting became established as a legitimate religious practice, it was difficult to challenge through rational argument or evidence of harm. The cultural preference for traditional wisdom over innovation created conservative biases that preserved dangerous practices long after their harmful effects became apparent. Medieval concepts of individual rights and autonomy were so limited that the modern notion of protecting individuals from harmful religious practices would have been largely incomprehensible. In a society where individuals had few recognized rights and were expected to subordinate their personal welfare to religious and social obligations, extreme religious practices could seem like admirable demonstrations of proper priorities. The medieval synthesis of classical and Christian traditions created unique cultural configurations that have not been replicated in subsequent historical periods. The specific combination of factors that made extreme religious fasting seem reasonable and admirable emerged from particular historical circumstances and disappeared as those circumstances changed. Chapter 21: Modern Therapeutic Approaches to Sacred Starvation. Contemporary therapeutic approaches to eating disorders and extreme religious behaviors have developed sophisticated methods for addressing conditions that bear similarities to medieval holy fasting. Understanding these modern treatments provides insights into both the psychological mechanisms involved in extreme fasting behaviors and the possibilities for intervention and recovery. Cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) has emerged as one of the most effective approaches for treating eating disorders, including those with religious or spiritual components. CBT focuses on identifying and changing the distorted thought patterns and beliefs that maintain disordered eating behaviors, helping individuals develop more realistic and healthy relationships with food and their bodies. When applied to religiously motivated eating restrictions, CBT approaches must carefully navigate between respecting patients' spiritual beliefs and addressing potentially harmful behaviors. Therapists work to help patients distinguish between healthy spiritual practices and behaviors that serve psychological rather than genuinely religious function. Family-based treatment approaches recognize that extreme eating behaviors often develop within family and social contexts that may inadvertently support or reinforce harmful patterns. These therapeutic approaches involve family members in the treatment process, helping them understand their roles in both maintaining and changing problematic behaviors. For individuals whose extreme fasting develops within religious communities, family-based approaches may need to extend to religious leaders and community members who may be unknowingly enabling harmful behaviors through the support and encouragement of extreme religious practices. Dialectical behavior therapy (DBT) has proven particularly effective for individuals whose eating disorders serve emotional regulation functions. DBT teaches specific skills for managing intense emotions without resorting to harmful behaviors, providing alternative coping mechanisms for individuals who have used food restriction to manage psychological distress. Many individuals who engage in extreme religious fasting may be using these behaviors to manage emotions such as anxiety, depression, guilt, or trauma-related symptoms. DBT approaches can help these individuals develop healthier ways of managing emotional distress while preserving their spiritual commitments. Acceptance and commitment therapy (ACT) emphasizes helping individuals identify their core values and develop behaviors that align with those values, even when doing so requires tolerating difficult emotions or experiences. For individuals struggling with religiously motivated eating restrictions, ACT approaches can help clarify whether their behaviors truly serve their spiritual values or represent psychological compulsions disguised as religious devotion. Trauma-informed approaches recognize that many individuals with eating disorders have histories of trauma that contribute to their disordered behaviors. For individuals whose extreme religious practices may represent responses to trauma, therapeutic approaches must address underlying traumatic experiences while also working with the religious and spiritual frameworks that have become associated with those experiences. Multidisciplinary treatment teams typically include medical professionals, mental health clinicians, nutritionists, and sometimes religious or spiritual counselors who can work together to address the complex medical, psychological, and spiritual aspects of extreme fasting behaviors. This collaborative approach recognizes that effective treatment requires attention to multiple dimensions of human experience. Medical management of individuals with extreme fasting-related malnutrition requires careful attention to both physical and psychological factors. The refeeding process must be conducted gradually and carefully to avoid potentially dangerous medical complications, while also addressing the psychological resistance that individuals often experience when asked to change deeply meaningful behaviors. Nutritional counseling approaches for individuals with religiously motivated eating restrictions must be sensitive to spiritual beliefs and practices, while also providing education about healthy nutrition and the medical consequences of extreme dietary restriction. Nutritionists working with these populations often need specialized training in religious and cultural sensitivity. Motivational interviewing techniques can be particularly helpful for individuals who are ambivalent about changing behaviors that they view as spiritually meaningful. These approaches help individuals explore their own motivations and concerns about change rather than imposing external judgments about the appropriateness of their behaviors. Group therapy approaches allow individuals with similar experiences to share their struggles and support each other's recovery efforts. For individuals whose extreme fasting develop within religious contexts, group therapy can provide alternative community support that honors spiritual concerns while promoting healthier behaviors. Spiritual and religious counseling approaches recognize that effective treatment for religiously motivated behaviors often requires addressing spiritual as well as psychological concerns. Clergy and spiritual directors with appropriate training can help individuals develop healthy spiritual practices that provide the meaning and connection they seek without endangering their physical health. Cultural competency training for mental health professionals working with individuals from religious communities emphasizes understanding the cultural and theological contexts that shape clients' experiences and beliefs. Effective treatment requires appreciation for the genuine spiritual concerns that may motivate extreme behaviors, even when those behaviors appear obviously harmful from secular perspectives. Relapse prevention approaches help individuals develop skills and support systems for maintaining healthy behaviors over time. For individuals recovering from extreme religious fasting, relapse prevention must address both the psychological vulnerabilities that contributed to the original behaviors and the ongoing spiritual and community factors that might trigger returns to extreme practices. Family and community education can help religious communities develop healthier approaches to spiritual practices and better recognition of when religious behaviors may be serving psychological rather than genuinely spiritual functions. This education can help prevent the development of extreme behaviors and promote early intervention when concerning patterns emerge. Chapter 22: Preventing Sacred Starvation in Contemporary Communities. The development of effective prevention strategies for extreme religious fasting requires understanding the complex interplay of individual, family, community, and cultural factors that can contribute to these dangerous practices. Prevention efforts must be culturally sensitive while also providing protection for vulnerable individuals, particularly children and adolescents who may be at risk within religious communities that valorize extreme ascetic practices. Education and awareness programs within religious communities can help leaders and members develop better understanding of the differences between healthy spiritual practices and potentially harmful behaviors that may masquerade as religious devotion. These programs must be developed in partnership with religious authorities to ensure cultural sensitivity and community acceptance. Religious education approaches can emphasize theological traditions that support moderation and balance in spiritual practices while providing alternative pathways for individuals seeking meaningful religious expression. Many religious traditions include teachings about the importance of caring for the body as well as the soul, providing theological resources for promoting healthier approaches to spiritual development. Training programs for religious leaders can help clergy and other spiritual authorities recognize warning signs of extreme religious behaviors and develop appropriate responses when concerning patterns emerge. This training must balance respect for religious autonomy with recognition of professional obligations to prevent harm. Mental health literacy programs within religious communities can help members recognize the psychological factors that may contribute to extreme religious behaviors and understand when professional intervention may be appropriate. These programs can reduce stigma around mental health issues while promoting help-seeking behaviors. Family education approaches can help parents and relatives develop skills for supporting healthy spiritual development in their children while recognizing and addressing concerning patterns that may indicate underlying psychological distress. This education must be tailored to the specific cultural and religious contexts of different communities. Screening and assessment protocols can help mental health and medical professionals identify individuals who may be at risk for developing extreme religious practices. These protocols must be culturally sensitive, while also providing systematic approaches for evaluating risk factors and developing appropriate interventions. Early intervention programs can provide support and resources for individuals who are beginning to engage in extreme religious practices before these behaviors become entrenched and life-threatening. Early intervention approaches must be acceptable to religious communities while also providing effective support for at-risk individuals. Community support networks can provide alternative sources of meaning, identity, and belonging for individuals who might otherwise seek ease through extreme religious practices. These networks can include peer support groups, mentorship programs, and community service opportunities that offer healthy ways of achieving significance and recognition. Media literacy programs can help community members critically evaluate religious and spiritual content in various media, including online communities that may promote extreme practices. These programs can help individuals recognize potentially harmful messages while developing skills for evaluating the credibility and safety of spiritual advice and guidance. Professional development programs for healthcare providers, educators, and social service workers can improve recognition and response to extreme religious practices that may pose health or safety risks. These programs must provide practical skills for working with religious communities while maintaining professional obligations to prevent harm. Policy development at institutional and governmental levels can establish frameworks for addressing extreme religious practices that balance religious freedom with protection of vulnerable individuals. These policies must be developed through inclusive processes that involve religious communities and other stakeholders. Research and evaluation efforts can help identify effective prevention strategies and improve understanding of the factors that contribute to extreme religious practices. This research must be conducted in partnership with religious communities to ensure cultural sensitivity and practical applicability. Cross-cultural dialogue and learning can help different religious communities share strategies for promoting healthy spiritual practices while preventing extreme behaviors. These exchanges can identify universal principles while respecting cultural and theological differences. Technology-based approaches can provide innovative ways of delivering education, support, and intervention services to individuals and communities that may be difficult to reach through traditional methods. Online platforms can offer anonymous support and information while connecting isolated individuals with appropriate resources. Quality improvement initiatives within religious organizations can help communities develop systematic approaches to promoting member welfare while maintaining spiritual authenticity. These initiatives can involve regular assessment of community practices and their effects on member health and well-being. Collaboration between religious and secular institutions can create comprehensive support systems that address both spiritual and psychological needs of individuals at risk for extreme religious practices. These partnerships can combine the credibility and cultural competence of religious organizations with the professional expertise of healthcare and social service providers. Chapter 23: Global Perspectives on Sacred Starvation. The phenomenon of extreme religious fasting is not limited to medieval European Christianity, but appears across cultures and time periods in various forms. Understanding these global perspectives provides insights into universal human tendencies, while also revealing how different cultural contexts shape the expression and interpretation of extreme ascetic practices. Hindu traditions include numerous forms of extreme fasting, ranging from brief ritual observances to potentially life-threatening practices undertaken by advanced spiritual practitioners. The concept of prayer-paves fasting unto death has ancient roots in Hindu scripture and continues to be practiced under specific circumstances, though it is generally regulated by traditional religious authorities. Hindu understandings of extreme fasting typically emphasize its role in spiritual purification and liberation from the cycle of reincarnation. Unlike medieval Christian fasting, which often emphasized suffering as valuable in itself, Hindu fasting traditions typically focus on transcending bodily attachments as preparation for higher spiritual states. Buddhist traditions generally discourage extreme fasting, reflecting the Buddha's own rejection of severe asceticism in favor of the middle way. However, some Buddhist communities have developed practices of gradual self-starvation as preparation for death, particularly in Japan, where the practice of Sokushinbutsu self-mummification involved months or years of dietary restriction leading to death. The Buddhist approach to extreme fasting typically emphasizes mindful awareness of the process rather than supernatural intervention. Practitioners openly acknowledge that their practices will lead to death, viewing this as a conscious choice rather than miraculous survival through divine intervention. Islamic traditions generally prohibit extreme fasting that poses health risks, though Sufi communities have sometimes developed ascetic practices that approach dangerous levels. The Quranic emphasis on moderation and the prohibition of suicide create theological frameworks that typically discourage extreme fasting practices. However, some Sufi traditions have incorporated forms of extreme dietary restriction as part of spiritual training, though these are usually temporary and conducted under careful supervision. The Islamic emphasis on community and social responsibility also creates safeguards against individual practices that might harm the practitioner or the community. Jain traditions include the most systematic and widely practiced form of voluntary fasting unto death in the contemporary world. Salakhana is regulated by detailed religious law and community oversight, providing a framework for voluntary death through gradual starvation under specific circumstances. The Jain approach to Salakhana emphasizes its role in achieving spiritual liberation while minimizing suffering for both the practitioner and their community. Unlike medieval Christian fasting, which often developed spontaneously and lacked systematic regulation, Jain Salakhana follows established procedures designed to ensure that the practice serves genuine spiritual purposes. Native American traditions include various forms of ritual fasting as part of vision quests and other spiritual practices. These traditions typically involve temporary food and water deprivation under community supervision and are generally time-limited to prevent serious health consequences. Native American fasting practices often emphasize connection with nature and spiritual guidance rather than bodily mortification. The community context and traditional knowledge about safe practices typically prevent the kind of extreme outcomes that characterize some medieval Christian fasting. African traditional religions include various forms of ritual fasting and dietary restriction, though extreme practices are usually regulated by community elders and traditional healers who have knowledge about safe limits and appropriate interventions when necessary. Contemporary African religious movements, including various Christian denominations, have sometimes incorporated extreme fasting practices that can become dangerous. These practices often combine traditional African spiritual concepts with Christian theology in ways that may lack adequate safeguards against harmful extremes. Chinese religious traditions, including Taoism and various forms of Buddhism, have generally emphasized balance and moderation in spiritual practices, though some traditions include forms of dietary restriction and fasting as components of spiritual development. The Chinese philosophical emphasis on harmony and balance typically prevents the kind of extreme ascetic practices that developed in medieval Christianity, though contemporary Chinese religious movements sometimes incorporate extreme practices adopted from other traditions. Contemporary global religious movements often combine elements from multiple traditions in ways that can create new forms of extreme practice. New Age spirituality, wellness culture, and various syncretic religious movements sometimes promote forms of extreme fasting that lack the traditional safeguards that develop within established religious traditions. The globalization of religious ideas through modern communication technology has created opportunities for extreme practices to spread beyond their original cultural contexts, sometimes without the traditional knowledge and community structures that helped regulate these practices in their original settings. International human rights frameworks have created new contexts for evaluating extreme religious practices, establishing principles that attempt to balance religious freedom with protection of human welfare. These frameworks influence domestic laws and policies while also creating standards for international cooperation and intervention. The migration of religious communities across national boundaries has created new challenges for legal systems that must address unfamiliar religious practices while maintaining consistent application of domestic law. Courts and social service agencies must develop cultural competence while also fulfilling their protective obligations. Global health initiatives increasingly recognize the need to address cultural and religious factors that influence health behaviors, including extreme religious practices that may pose health risks. The World Health Organization and other international bodies have developed guidelines for addressing these issues while respecting cultural diversity. Comparative religious studies have revealed both universal patterns and culture-specific variations in extreme religious practices. providing insights into the psychological and social functions these practices serve, while also highlighting the importance of cultural context in shaping their expression and outcomes. Chapter 24: The Future of Sacred Starvation. As we look toward the future, questions about extreme religious fasting and its contemporary manifestations will continue to challenge societies attempting to balance religious freedom, individual autonomy, and collective welfare. Understanding potential future developments requires examining current trends in technology, globalization, medical knowledge, and religious practice that may shape how these issues evolve. Advances in medical technology and monitoring may create new possibilities for safely managing extreme fasting practices while preserving their religious significance. Continuous monitoring devices, improved nutritional support, and better understanding of the physiological effects of fasting may allow for religious practices that maintain spiritual authenticity while minimizing health risks. However, technological solutions also raise ethical questions about the appropriate level of medical intervention in religious practices. The ability to monitor and potentially intervene in extreme fasting practices may create new tensions between religious autonomy and medical obligations to prevent harm. The development of virtual reality and other immersive technologies may create alternative ways of achieving the altered states of consciousness that extreme fasting practitioners have traditionally sought. These technologies might provide the psychological and spiritual benefits of extreme practices without the associated physical dangers. Genetic research in personalized medicine may eventually provide better understanding of individual susceptibility to eating disorders and extreme religious behaviors, potentially allowing for more targeted prevention and intervention strategies. However, this research also raises ethical concerns about genetic privacy and discrimination. Globalization and digital communication will likely continue to facilitate the spread of religious ideas and practices across cultural boundaries, potentially creating new forms of extreme behavior that combine elements from different traditions in unpredictable ways. Online communities may provide both support and enablement for extreme practices. Climate change and environmental degradation may create new contexts for understanding voluntary suffering and sacrifice, potentially providing new theological and philosophical frameworks for extreme ascetic practices. Environmental apocalyptic movements might incorporate extreme fasting as forms of witness or penance. Changing patterns of religious belief and practice in secularizing societies may lead to the development of new forms of extreme behavior that serve some of the same psychological functions as traditional religious practices, but within secular frameworks. The rise of extreme fitness culture and wellness movements may represent contemporary versions of traditional ascetic practices. Advances in neuroscience and psychology will likely continue to provide better understanding of the mechanisms underlying extreme religious behavior, potentially leading to more effective prevention and treatment approaches. However, this knowledge may also create new ethical dilemmas about the appropriate limits of intervention and behaviors that individuals view as meaningful and authentic. Legal systems will need to continue evolving to address novel forms of extreme religious practice while maintaining consistent principles for balancing religious freedom with protective obligations. International cooperation and harmonization of approaches may become increasingly important as religious practices cross national boundaries. Mental health awareness and treatment approaches will likely continue developing more sophisticated methods for addressing religiously motivated extreme behaviors. However, the persistent stigma around mental health issues within some religious communities may continue to create barriers to help seeking and intervention. Educational approaches and media literacy may become increasingly important for helping individuals and communities evaluate religious and spiritual guidance critically while maintaining respect for authentic spiritual seeking. The challenge will be distinguishing between healthy skepticism and destructive cynicism toward religious experience. Professional training and development for healthcare providers, educators, and other professionals will need to keep pace with evolving understanding of extreme religious practices while also addressing the cultural and religious diversity of contemporary societies. Research and evaluation efforts will need to continue developing evidence-based approaches to understanding and addressing extreme religious practices while respecting the rights and dignity of religious communities. Participatory research approaches that involve religious communities as partners rather than subjects may become increasingly important. Policy development at all levels of society will need to continue balancing competing values and principles while adapting to changing social, technological, and religious contexts. These policies will need to be developed through inclusive processes that involve all stakeholders and consider long-term consequences. The role of religious institutions and leadership in preventing extreme practices while maintaining authentic spiritual traditions will remain crucial. Religious communities will need to continue developing internal resources and approaches for addressing extreme behaviors while preserving their distinctive spiritual emphases. International cooperation and dialogue will become increasingly important for addressing global patterns of extreme religious practice while respecting cultural and religious diversity. Shared standards and approaches may need to be developed while preserving space for legitimate cultural variation. The challenge for future societies will be maintaining openness to authentic spiritual experience and religious diversity while also protecting vulnerable individuals from harm. This will require continued development of nuanced approaches that can distinguish between healthy spiritual seeking and potentially dangerous behaviors that may masquerade as religious practice. Ultimately, the future of extreme religious fasting and similar practices will depend on humanity's ability to learn from historical experience while adapting to changing circumstances. The medieval phenomenon of holy fasting provides both cautionary lessons about the dangers of extreme religious behavior and insights into the persistent human need for meaning, transcendence, and spiritual connection that drive such practices. Conclusion: lessons from the Valley of Sacred Starvation. As we reach the end of our comprehensive journey through the dark landscape of medieval holy fasting, we find ourselves confronting fundamental questions about human nature, spirituality, and the complex relationship between individual seeking and collective responsibility. The phenomenon of medieval holy fasting, where devout individuals literally starved themselves to death in pursuit of spiritual perfection, represents one of history's most disturbing examples of how cultural frameworks can transform potentially deadly behaviors into celebrated acts of holiness. The medieval practice of holy fasting emerged from a unique confluence of theological, social, and psychological factors that created perfect conditions for extreme religious behavior. The Christian emphasis on bodily mortification, combined with limited opportunities for female religious expression, severe social constraints, and primitive medical understanding, produced an environment where starving oneself to death could seem like a reasonable and even admirable spiritual choice. Yet we must remember that the individuals who engaged in these practices were not merely victims of religious delusion or cultural manipulation. They were human beings responding to genuine spiritual hunger and authentic desires for meaning, transcendence, and connection with the divine. Their tragic fates resulted not from the illegitimacy of their spiritual seeking, but from the limitations of the cultural and religious frameworks available to them for expressing and fulfilling their deepest spiritual needs. The medieval holy fasters were pioneers and martyrs of human spiritual exploration, pushing the boundaries of what seemed possible in their quest for ultimate truth and divine union. That their explorations often led to death rather than enlightenment reflects the dangers inherent in spiritual seeking without adequate knowledge, community wisdom, or institutional safeguards to prevent harmful extremes. Modern medical and psychological understanding has provided us with tools that medieval people lacked for recognizing and addressing the complex factors that contribute to extreme religious behavior. We now understand the neurochemical effects of starvation, the psychological functions of eating disorders, and the social dynamics that can support or prevent harmful behaviors. This knowledge creates both opportunities and obligations for developing more compassionate and effective responses to contemporary manifestations of extreme spiritual seeking. Yet we must be careful not to dismiss the profound spiritual insights and authentic religious experiences that may have emerged from medieval holy fasting, even as we recognize its dangers. The altered states of consciousness produced by extreme fasting may have provided genuine glimpses of transcendent reality, even if they were achieved through methods that we can no longer consider acceptable or safe. The persistence of similar practices in contemporary society, from anorexia nervosa to religious fasting traditions to political hunger strikes, reveals the enduring human needs that medieval holy fasting attempted to address. People continue to seek control, meaning, identity, and transcendence through relationships with food and eating, suggesting that the underlying psychological and spiritual dynamics remain relevant despite changed cultural contexts. The challenge for contemporary societies is developing frameworks that honor authentic spiritual seeking while providing protection against harmful extremes. This requires sophisticated understanding of the complex interplay between individual psychology, cultural values, and spiritual needs that can either support healthy development or lead to dangerous behaviors. Religious communities face particular responsibilities for providing guidance and support that channels spiritual seeking in healthy directions while remaining alert to signs that individual practitioners may be pursuing dangerous extremes. The medieval church's ambivalent response to holy fasting provides both positive examples of pastoral care and cautionary lessons about the dangers of prioritizing institutional interests over individual welfare. Mental health professionals must continue developing culturally sensitive approaches that respect religious beliefs while addressing psychological factors that may contribute to extreme behaviors. This requires ongoing education about religious traditions and practices, as well as continued research into the complex relationships between spirituality and mental health. Legal and policy frameworks must continue evolving to balance religious freedom with protective obligations, recognizing that both excessive intervention and neglect can cause harm. The development of appropriate responses requires ongoing dialogue between religious communities, healthcare providers, legal authorities, and other stakeholders. Educational approaches at all levels of society must provide better understanding of the relationship between spiritual seeking and psychological well-being, helping individuals and communities recognize both the value and the dangers of intensive religious practice. This education must be grounded in respect for religious diversity while also promoting critical thinking about spiritual claims and practices. The global context of contemporary society creates new challenges and opportunities for addressing extreme religious practices. International cooperation and dialogue can facilitate sharing of effective approaches while respecting cultural and religious diversity. However, globalization also creates possibilities for harmful practices to spread beyond their original cultural contexts without traditional safeguards. Future developments in technology, medicine, and our understanding of consciousness may create new possibilities for achieving the spiritual goals that drove medieval holy fasting without the associated dangers. Virtual reality, neurofeedback, psychedelic research, and other emerging fields may provide safer pathways to transcendent experience and spiritual development. Yet we must also remain aware that technological solutions cannot address the fundamental human needs for meaning, community, and transcendence that motivate extreme spiritual seeking. Any complete response to these phenomena must address not only their immediate dangers, but also the underlying spiritual and psychological needs they represent. The story of medieval holy fasting ultimately reminds us of both the nobility and the tragedy of human spiritual seeking. These individuals who starved themselves to death in pursuit of divine union were responding to the highest human aspirations for transcendence and meaning. Their tragic fates remind us of our ongoing responsibility to create societies that provide safe and healthy pathways for spiritual development while honoring the authenticity and importance of the spiritual quest itself. As we face contemporary challenges related to extreme religious behavior, eating disorders, and the search for meaning in increasingly secular societies, the medieval experience of holy fasting provides valuable lessons about both the potential and the pitfalls of intensive spiritual practice. By understanding this history, we can better address the persistent human needs that it represents while avoiding the tragic outcomes that it often produced. The legacy of medieval holy fasting challenges us to continue the ongoing work of creating societies that support authentic spiritual development while protecting the vulnerable and maintaining commitment to human flourishing. Their sacrifice was not meaningless if we can learn from their experience to create wiser and more compassionate approaches to the eternal human quest for meaning, transcendence, and union with the divine. In closing, let us honor the memory of those who paid the ultimate price in their pursuit of spiritual truth, while committing ourselves to ensuring that future seekers have access to safer and more sustainable paths toward the spiritual fulfillment they sought. The medieval holy fasters died so that we might learn to live more wisely, and their legacy calls us to continue the sacred work of making the spiritual path both authentic and safe for all who feel called to walk it. The phenomenon of holy hunger strikes in medieval times stands as both a testament to the power of human spiritual longing and a stark warning about the dangers of extreme religious practice. As we continue to grapple with questions of faith, meaning, and transcendence in our own time, may we remember their story with both compassion and wisdom, honoring their spiritual courage while learning from their tragic fate. Their hunger was holy, their sacrifice was real, and their legacy continues to challenge us to find better ways of feeding the deepest hungers of the human soul. And that brings us to the end of this extraordinary journey through one of history's most haunting spiritual phenomena. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed the remarkable story of how medieval people literally starved themselves to death in pursuit of holiness, a practice that reveals profound truths about human nature, spiritual seeking, and the complex relationship between faith and suffering. What did you think of this deep dive into medieval holy fasting? Have you ever encountered similar extreme practices in modern religious communities? Do you think there are healthier ways to achieve the spiritual transcendence these medieval practitioners were seeking? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. This topic touches on some of the deepest questions about human spirituality and the lengths people will go to in search of meaning and connection with the divine. Your perspectives and experiences could add valuable insights to this conversation. If you found this exploration of medieval holy fasting as fascinating and disturbing as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps support the channel and lets me know you're interested in more deep dives into history's strangest and most thought-provoking phenomena. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. We're constantly exploring the darker corners of human history, uncovering stories that reveal both the worst and the best of what we're capable of as a species. From medieval practices like holy fasting to other bizarre historical phenomena, there's always something new and mind-bending to discover. Don't forget to share this video with anyone you think might be interested in the intersection of history, psychology, and spirituality. These stories deserve to be told and remembered, not just for their shock value, but for the profound lessons they teach us about human nature and the eternal quest for meaning. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the strange world of medieval holy fasting. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep questioning the fascinating complexities of human behavior throughout history. There's always more to learn about what makes us human. Subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll see you in the next deep dive into history's most intriguing mysteries.